President Warren Harding. This program is about 3 hours.
He was Mr. Nice Guy, a people person, fond of children and dogs.
I love to meet people. It's the most pleasant thing I do, and is really the only fun I have.
But some might say Warren Harding liked people too much. His good-natured trust in others spelled scandal when the public discovered that members of his administration were trying to get rich behind his back. He was also a reputed womanizer who reportedly engaged in at least 2 extramarital affairs, one of which may have resulted in the birth of a daughter. Harding liked to poke fun at his affable nature, once recounting in public the following words of his father, George.
Warren, it's a good thing you wasn't born a gal, because you'd be in the family way all the time. You can't say no.
Harding grew up in Ohio, where he was born 7 months after Lincoln was shot in 1865. While still a teenager, he joined 2 friends in purchasing a struggling local newspaper he'd later call the Marion Star. The venture was a success, and Harding soon gained full ownership. When he was 25, he married 30-year-old Florence Kling DeWolf, a divorced mother who later joined her new husband in building his newspaper enterprise. She also supported his fledgling political ambitions. Harding made a failed bid for county auditor in 1892, but 6 years later won a seat in the Ohio State Senate, serving 2 terms before becoming the state's lieutenant governor. Along the way, his good looks and easy manner captured the attention of a well-connected political advisor named Harry Doherty, who later helped Harding win a Senate seat in 1914 and the Republican nomination for president in 1920. Harding and running mate Calvin Coolidge went on to win the White House with an unprecedented majority of the popular vote. The rapid ascent of his political career bemused Harding, who once in office was quick to admit his limitations.
I don't know what to do or where to turn. Somewhere there must be a book that tells all about it. My God, but this is a hell of a place for a man like me to be in.
The public forgave Harding his shortcomings, and while in the White House, he and his wife were tremendously popular. Mrs. Harding threw lavish lawn parties and shared her husband's affinity for meeting people, once shaking almost 7,000 hands in a single afternoon. Harding enjoyed his time in office as well. As president, he played golf, watched baseball, and hosted twice-weekly poker games with a group of office holders he dubbed his poker cabinet. Additional pastimes, though, allegedly included stepping out with other women. After his death, reputed mistress Nan Bredon scandalized the nation with a tell-all bestseller alleging that the former president had fathered her child. But Harding also brought a measure of honor to the office. He traveled to Alabama in 1921, becoming the first president to advocate civil rights for blacks on Southern soil. He also established the Budget Bureau, convened international arms talks, and pardoned labor leader and wartime protester Eugene Debs. His efforts were ultimately overshadowed, however, by the activities of certain appointees in his administration who were secretly engaging in graft and fraud without his knowledge. Their actions resulted in a series of scandals that unfolded after his presidency, the most notorious involving the nation's oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Rumors of such shady White House dealings had just begun to surface when Harding and his wife left Washington for a cross-country tour in June of his second summer as president. During the trip, Harding's health began to fail, and while in San Francisco, the president suffered from what is believed to have been congestive heart failure. He died August 2, 1923, sometime after listening to his wife read him an adulatory magazine article on his presidency. His reported last words were, "That's good. Go on, read some more." He was 57.
When the light of life goes out, there's a new radiance in eternity. Somehow the glow of it relieves the darkness which is left behind.
Well, this is President-elect Warren G. Harding and his wife Florence on the front porch of their home saying goodbye to the folks of Marion, Ohio. That's where they're from. They're on their way to Washington at this point in history. Warren Harding would be sworn in a couple of days later as the 29th President of the United States. These scenes, again, are from the front porch of their home, and we are at the very same location live this morning in Marion, Ohio, as we continue our series, American Presidents Life Portraits. You can see the front porch there, sitting along Mount Vernon Avenue in Marion, Ohio. As we take a look inside this house, this is the foyer area, the entranceway, and there's a portrait of the 29th president there on the left-hand wall. Moving beyond that room is the parlor area, and beyond that room is the library and the old Victrola machine that's playing that song that we just heard. Melinda Gilpin is Historic Site Manager at the Harding home. She joins us from the library. Good morning.
Good morning.
Tell us, what was that song we were hearing?
Well, the song we were hearing was called the President Harding March, and it was composed right after Mr. Harding won the presidency in 1920.
Tell us exactly where in the house you are located right now.
Right now I'm in the library of the home. We're on the west side of the house, and this would have been Mr. Harding's favorite room. This is where he would have done his reading, his relaxing in the evening, and played poker with his friends.
Tell us more about the house overall. What did the Hardings build?
Well, the Hardings built a wonderful Victorian home in 1890, completed it in 1891. It has 10 rooms. The library is adjacent to the parlor here, and this is where you would have been entertained by the Hardings if you had come here as a guest. Most of the furnishings in this house are original, and as is all the furniture in this room in the parlor. This parlor is adjacent then to our reception hall. And this is the formal room where all of the interesting guests would have been received during the famous campaign of 1920.
And there was a very special event on the spot where you're standing.
There actually was a very special event on this spot. This is right where the Hardings married on July the 8th of 1891 after the home was completed during their engagement.
What was life like overall for the Hardings in this house?
Life was a lot of fun for them. They did a lot of entertaining. This house is famous for open houses, wonderful decorations at Christmas time and other holidays, and people from Marion are really talk about being here and being entertained by the Hardings before his political career.
I want to give you an exact sense of where we are. Again, this is Marion, Ohio. We're about 2 hours south of Toledo, maybe an hour, a little more than an hour north of Columbus, Ohio, north central Ohio. And again, the house sits on Mount Vernon Street. You can see the map of Ohio there, and we are in Marion. Again, the house sits on Mount Vernon Avenue in this city. And we'd like to invite our viewers to phone in with their questions and comments on the life and presidency of Warren G. Harding. The numbers to call are 202-624-1111 if you live in the East or Central time zones, and out west, 202-624-1115. We have several more guests, and we will get to your calls in just a couple minutes. We're going to ask Melinda Gilpin to head out from that foyer area to the front porch and tell us more about the historic significance of that part of the house.
Well, the porch is a very significant part of the home. This is where Mr. Harding conducted his front porch campaign, the last of the Ohio front porch campaigns in 1920. He conducted his campaign over a 4-month period here in Marion, and in that time he spoke to over 600,000 people off of this front porch.
What was the sense of excitement back in those days with the big crowds gathering?
Well, in those days it was quite exciting, not only for the people of Marion who came out. They knew Mr. Harding very well, but they didn't know all the other exciting people that were coming here to see him. And people traveled from across the country by train here to listen to the candidates speak and talk about their particular voting interests.
And you can probably see the folks back at home, a lot of folks standing behind you with umbrellas. It is raining, but they are gathered for a specific purpose. What's going to happen later?
Well, at about 10 o'clock we are going to have Mr. Ken Hammondtree, who is a living history performer, and he will be reenacting one of Mr. Harding's speeches. He delivered the speech in Marion, Ohio, although not off the front porch. But Mr. Hammondtree will be delivering that speech later today.
Melinda Gilpin, we are going to say thanks and ask you to hang around for the entire length of the program. We're going to go back to you time to time for more of a look inside the house and the life of the Hardings here in Marion. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Once again, we are along Mount Vernon Avenue. Our set is situated just to the left side of this house, and we are joined on the lawn under a tent by Robert Farrell, retired professor and author of a book called The Strange Deaths of President Harding. Good morning.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here today, even in the rain.
We appreciate you coming. Tell us what the election of 1920 was all about.
I think it was really anti-President Wilson. It was, you might say, a negative vote on the Wilson administration, and the problem was that that administration had virtually collapsed when President Wilson suffered a stroke in October of 1919. For the last year and a half, the Wilson administration was almost totally ineffective, and the country turned against him, as well, of course, as the League of Nations, which was one of the issues of that era.
And the two tickets running in 1920, who were they?
The two tickets were both Ohio newspaper men. It's a strange thing that two newspaper men, one in Dayton, this was James M. Cox, and the other, of course, Warren Harding of the Marion Star, were running against each other, and the vice presidents of the vice presidential nominees were, of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt on the Democratic side, and Calvin Coolidge on the Republican side. It was a rather distinguished group of people, if you consider two later presidents of the United States running for the vice presidency.
We are also joined this morning live from Richmond, Virginia by Professor Eugene Trani. He is author of The Presidency of Warren G. Harding. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Pleased to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us exactly how Warren G. Harding fit into this whole scene in 1920, and how did he do it? How did he win?
Well, I think Professor Farrell had it right on that the big issues in the campaign of 1920 were the issue of the League of Nations and the issue of Woodrow Wilson, of the collapse of Woodrow Wilson. An interesting question is, how did Warren G. Harding get the nomination? Because Harding clearly was not favored for the nomination in 1920. The two favorites were General Leonard Wood and the Illinois governor, Frank Lowden. It went 9 ballots in Chicago. There was allegedly a very famous smoke-filled room meeting at which people agreed that Harding would become the candidate. Wood and Loudon sort of knocked one another out, and Harding always hung around during the nomination process, and he was nominated on the 9th ballot. And then, as Professor Farrell said, ran against James Middleton Cox and slaughtered Cox. Harding got over 16 million votes to 9 million votes for Cox. He got 404 electoral votes, and Cox got 127 electoral votes. And then we had Warren G. Harding as president.
We are going to keep our two guests, our two professor guests here for the entire length of the program as well. But let's get to calls for now. We're talking about Warren G. Harding, the 29th U.S. President, Pensacola, Florida. Good morning.
Hi there. I have heard that allegedly that Mrs. Harding murdered President Harding because she was tired of his philandering, and there was apparently a FBI file that was sealed and finally been opened up years later on, sort of confirming that. Could I get some comments on that?
Yeah, let's go to Robert Farrell, author of The Strange Deaths of President Harding. What's the story of the death of the president?
The story of the death of the president is that he died of heart failure. This in San Francisco, August 2nd, 1923. I think where you read that was perhaps in a book by a man named Gaston B. Means, which was entirely fictional. And if you didn't read it there, you read it in a book by Carl S. Anthony that was published last year, which I consider almost as fictional as the Means book.
Professor Trani, what was the reaction to the death of President Harding?
Well, there was great sadness. He was a very popular president, and there was great sadness as his body came across the United States. But then quickly thereafter, the scandals of the Harding administration began to unfold, and I think that's at least in part why Harding is ranked so poorly in terms of the American presidents.
I'm going to talk about those rankings in a moment. Exactly how long did Harding serve, Professor Trani?
He served from March the 4th, 1921 to August the 2nd, 1923. So what is that, 27 months as President of the United States?
Let's get a call from Flint, Michigan this Monday morning. Hello.
Hello. I was interested in if any of the gentlemen know of the ancestry of President Harding, where his family came from, particularly whether there was an ancestor by the name of Bush. I have been told that I was related to him in some fashion, and I was just curious where his family came from and perhaps some of the names in his ancestry.
Why don't we ask Melinda Gilpin to help us with that? She is based here at the Harding Home and Museum. Can you help us with that?
I can help you a little bit. In the Harding genealogy, I have not seen the name of Bush. The original settler in Ohio was an Amos Harding. He came from the Pennsylvania area, and he had two brothers that came here. Descendants of them were the parents of Warren Harding. We do have some pictures here in the library of Mr. Harding's family. Included in that is George T. Harding and his wife Elizabeth. And they were some of the original settlers here in the Marion and Ohio area of the Harding family. George T. Harding had a son by the name of Charles Alexander Harding, and his picture is here with his wife Elizabeth. And Charles Alexander was a farmer, as all of the Hardings were. They settled here because land was cheap after Ohio became available for settlement. I believe they bought their land for $2 an acre. And many, many Hardings settled in the Blooming Grove area, or you may know that as Corsica. And the Corsica area, Blooming Grove, is about 30 miles east of Marion, where we currently are located.
And we have some pictures of the birthplace of Warren G. Harding. We'll ask Robert Farrell at this point to tell us about the boyhood. What kind of world did he grow up in?
This was bucolic, this was agricultural, and it still is. If you go out east of Marion, just last night I was out in the little village of Clarendon, where he did not live, but if you go on a little further, you get to Blooming Grove, near which he was born. He was not born, you might say, in the town. It wasn't a town, it was a village. There are 6 or 8 houses still there. And his house, of course, has long since been torn down.
What did his parents do?
Farmers. They were farmers, and then his father did some small amount of medical study in Cleveland, and pronounced himself a doctor. In those days, all you had to do was go to the local county and register yourself as a doctor, and you became a doctor automatically. So that's what happened to him.
Professor Farrell or Professor Trani, maybe you can jump in on this. Who were the early influences, the most important influences of Warren Harding when he was growing up? Professor Trani, you can take that.
Clearly, his family was very, very important to him. Settling in the kind of background that Professor Farrell talked about. He got into newspaper work early, became a strong Republican, and the influences of the Republican Party also had a great effect on him. And then he served 3 political offices before he became President of the United States. He was a member of the Ohio State Senate from 1900 to 1904. He was Lieutenant Governor of Ohio from 1904 to 1906. And then he was part of the first group of senators that were popularly elected in 1914, the United States Senate, and served a term from 1915 until he became President of the United States.
Let's get a call from Manning, South Carolina this morning on Warren G. Harding. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I remember studying in elementary school. There were some mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of President Harding, and I had wondered if either of your panel members were aware of any investigations that surrounded the mysterious death of President Harding.
It's the exact
of an individual or a group.
It's the topic that was brought up by our initial caller. Professor Farrell, can you tell us more about the death?
Oh yes, the death was an interesting one in the sense that there were 5 physicians present. This was in San Francisco. One of them was the then president of the American Medical Association. This was Ray Lyman Wilbur. There was a cardiologist there named Cooper. There was a past president of the AMA, and they all misdiagnosed the death. They said that Harding died of a stroke. Actually, a stroke takes 10 minutes. The defining difference between a stroke and a heart attack is that a stroke takes 10 minutes and a heart attack is instant. He clearly died of a heart attack. And this was a confusion. If there had been an autopsy, which Mrs. Harding did not want, that might have stopped the confusion. But then the rumors began, and whoever that grade school teacher was advancing a rumor that she or he had no basis for.
Melinda Gilpin, inside the Harding home. What happened to the home once President Harding passed away?
Well, actually, the Hardings had leased the home in 1921 when they left for the White House, and therefore the home was still being leased for 4 years to some friends of theirs that had lived in Marion and needed a place to live. In 1927, the Harding Memorial Association took over the home from the people who had been renting it from the Hardings, and it's been a museum ever since.
We're going to stay with you just for a moment, Melinda Gilpin, to tell us a little bit more about the property. There's not just the main house, but behind where we are sitting here outside on the lawn is another small building. Tell us about what's behind us.
That's right. That building was purchased from the Sears catalog by Mr. Harding in 1920, and it is what we call the press house. It's the only building in our country that was built specifically for reporters to use during a political campaign. Mr. Harding, of course, being a newspaper man, knew that the best way to get good press coverage was to make sure that the press was comfortable, and he did so by providing them with office space right here adjacent to the property. During the campaign, they would just walk up to the front porch, take their video, make their notes, and they'd go then back to the press house, write up their stories before they took them to the telegraph office to get them out on the wires.
And we'll point out that the Marion Star does still exist. This is an edition from yesterday here in Marion, Ohio. The daily paper comes out about 12:30 in the afternoon, but this newspaper does still exist after all of these years. Professor Trani out in Richmond, tell us more about the relationship between President Harding and the press.
He had a very good relationship with the press. Clearly, being one of them by being the editor, publisher of the Marion Star, and he worked very hard at it. He met with the press on a regular basis. The press was starving for attention from the White House because of Wilson's illness and Wilson's inaccessibility in terms of the press. So the press liked Harding, he liked them, and I think he very effectively used the press to advance some of his ideas, some of his political goals. Very, very successful with the press.
Let's take a call from Chicago for our guests. Good morning.
Good morning. This is for Professor Farrell. This is your friend in Chicago who I've been talking to you over the last number of months. You remember me, the attorney in Chicago?
Oh, I certainly do.
How have you been, Professor?
Glad to hear from you.
Listen, I have a question for you regarding the 1920 election. I believe, of course, the World War I was probably the most unpopular war in this century. There was, I think there was something like 11% of the people who were drafted. It was something like 300,000 people who evaded the draft. There was also 330,000 casualties in Europe. I think 114,000 deaths between April 1917 and the end of the war. And I think that had a lot to do with the big election victory of Harding, because there was a total animosity toward the Democrat Party in 1920 as a result of that war. Can you give me a comment on that?
Thank you.
I don't quite agree with you. As you know, I'm a card-carrying Democrat, and I think there was a bit of a Republican statement in that. I don't think it was that unpopular. The problem was the peace, which didn't work out right. The League of Nations didn't work out right. And then, of course, there was the very large problem of Wilson's collapse, and with it the collapse, I think, of the Wilson administration. I think this is what led into the campaign and Harding's enormous success. It was the largest plurality until Franklin Roosevelt in 1936.
Professor Trani, if you can expand on that, you mentioned some of the numbers before, a big majority win for Harding. Tell us more about the role of women during that election in 1920.
Well, this, of course, was the first election in which women voted. The suffrage amendment having been passed, and it was a big deal. And Harding worked very hard so that women certainly played a significant role in the election and in the administration from Harding's perspective, that he certainly catered to women and thought they were very, very important.
Do you have a sense of exactly how many women took part in the election?
I do not know the percent of women that took part in the election. 25 million people voted. There were 106 million Americans at that time, up from about 30 million from 20 years before, so dramatic growth in population. Obviously, the women played a significant role in the election.
We'll point out that as the program goes on, we're going to go back inside that museum from time to time and show you some of the pictures that are inside that museum. Again, the old house where the media used to camp out. You'll see a number of newspaper headlines from Harding's life and career, so we'll take a look at those as time goes on here and get this call in from Jamestown, New York. Hi.
Good morning, C-SPAN.
Morning.
Really enjoying your presidential series, and questions have to do with President Harding's Masonic affiliation, and in particular his laying the cornerstone Masonically for the George Washington Masonic Memorial on Shooter's Hill in Alexandria, and the dignitaries that crossed the political lines that were present there on that day. And I just wondered if your historians could shed some light on his Masonic affiliations and that event in particular.
Thank you. Robert Farrell, can you help us with that?
I wish I could, but that's one subject I don't know about.
Professor Trani?
No, I'm sorry, I do not know anything about.
Let's check with Melinda Gilpin. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I know he was a Mason, and he was a 32nd degree Mason. As a matter of fact, his ceremony to promote him to a 33rd degree Mason was planned, but he died, unfortunately, before he was able to go through that ceremony. I know it took him quite a while to become a Mason. He had been blackballed for a number of years from the local Masonic order. I don't know specifically about the particular incident that the caller is asking about, and I'm sorry for that, but I'm not as familiar with his Masonic affiliation as I would like to be.
Melinda Gilpin, while we have you there, let's learn a little bit more about Warren Harding here in Marion. What do the folks here think of him?
Well, he was always known as a very friendly person, someone who was willing to give people a job and a chance. Many workers worked for him at the Marion Star. Very famous for all of the newsboys. Many people in Marion had their first job carrying the Marion Star to their neighbors and friends.
Robert Farrell, how did his disposition and his friendliness play itself out during his political career?
I think it was one of his great qualities. It was a quality that President Wilson utterly lacked. Wilson could be terribly cold. I hesitate to say it, but he was a college administrator, and sometimes not a very good one. He alienated the faculty at Princeton, and he alienated the Senate, and Harding would never do a thing like that. This was one of Harding's great qualities.
Professor Trani, want to weigh in on that?
No, I think that Professor Farrell is certainly correct that Harding worked very hard at relationships, and the relationships between Congress and the presidency were not good as a result of the Wilson term, and Harding set out to make sure that those relationships improved significantly.
We have a caller this morning from Amelia Island, Florida. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Great show. This question is posed towards Professor Trani. I attended college up outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and while hiking one day with a buddy of mine, we found a satchel with a manuscript, very old, by a Gaston B. Means about Harding. And I was sitting here, and when you mentioned his name, I almost fell out of my chair. We still have this thing. It's all beat up. It's a couple hundred pages, but it was stuffed in an old satchel in the mountains of North Carolina, and I've never known what to do with it, but it was such a peculiar thing to hear his name mentioned. And could you tell me about him and who he was?
Well, Professor Farrell mentioned him. This is the author of this book of The Strange Death of President Harding. Professor Farrell, you want to say a little more about Gaston Means?
You know, I wish that our caller here would Xerox 2 or 3 of those pages and send them to me. I'd be delighted to see them. It sounds to me as if it's old page proof, something of that sort. The book itself was later denounced by the woman who wrote it. Means did not write the book. She has an article in Liberty magazine in 1931 in which she said it was all false. And I believe that.
That was The Strange Death.
That was The Strange Death of President Harding, which was published in 1930.
And your
it was
book,
a hoax.
And your book was The Strange Deaths of President Harding.
I call my book, plural, The Strange Deaths, because I discussed the physical death of the president, and then secondly, and much more so, I discussed the death of his reputation, which indeed was reduced almost to nothing by the late 1920s, certainly by 1930. And that's where it is right now. When the polls come out, the Schlesinger poll of December 15th in the New York Times, 1996, or yes, Harding was the last in the American presidents, voted the worst. And of course, I don't believe that.
We have a pretty good sized crowd gathering here in Marion, Ohio, in front of the Harding House, where in just a little bit we're going to hear from a gentleman from here in Ohio, Ken Hammontree, who is going to reenact a speech by President Warren G. Harding. Again, you can see the umbrellas there. It is raining this morning, but pretty good group, several dozen folks already gathering. A lot of them are school kids from the Marion Harding High School, so we'll take a look at that reenactment in just a little bit. Let's get a call from Bellevue, Washington. Go ahead.
Hi, I was reading in my Constitution about how it used to be that the members of the House of Representatives were chosen according to the population of 30,000 people, if you look at Article 1, Section 2, third paragraph. But then during the 1920s, they came to the conclusion that to maintain the proper ratio in the Congress, they couldn't continue to increase the members in the House of Representatives, so they decided that 435 or something like that would be the number that they would stop at. Perhaps your authors there can further talk about that.
Eugene Trani?
The number of the House of Representatives does not change. It's the as the population grows, there are reapportionments, and some states will lose seats, some states will gain seats. So whatever it started at, it clearly has grown dramatically by the 1920s, and clearly has grown even more today. And I believe it's 500,000 people per congressional district now.
Wanted to talk a little bit about the historical polls that have taken place since the death of Warren Harding over the years. It's pretty hard to find a poll that doesn't place Warren Harding at or near the very bottom, and wanted to get a sense from our two guests as to why that might be the case. Robert Farrell?
It's not merely pretty hard, it's impossible. Every single poll, the first one was taken by Arthur Schlesinger Sr. in 1948, this for the New York Times. Harding came in last, and there have been 8 or 10 of these, and more if you want to count some that I don't think statistically really should be counted. And in every single one, Harding comes in last.
Did he get a fair deal?
I don't think so. Not at all. I'd be glad to explain.
Go ahead.
It seems to me that the so-called Harding scandals, and you hear that word all the time, have been vastly over-exaggerated. And of the 3 that we frequently hear of, only one involving the Veterans Administration did Harding have any way of finding out even part of the story. And that part he acted on immediately. He dismissed the director of the Veterans Administration, who was Colonel Forbes.
What was going on in the Vets Administration?
Forbes was taking money. He was taking money from apparently the selling of goods out of a large medical warehouse that was under his charge in Maryland. And Dr. Sawyer, who was the president's personal physician, told him about it, and he acted immediately. He actually had Forbes in the White House, and a New York Times reporter caught him shaking him like a rat. And he was saying some things to him that are not exactly printable. And he sent him on a mission to France, and as soon as Forbes got over there, he fired him, which was all he could do at the time. He had no proof that Forbes had taken money, but it did look like it. And later it turned out that Forbes had done it. There was more that came out. It didn't come out for half a year after Harding died. He had no way of knowing about this, and Forbes went to jail.
Professor Trani, what about those polls, those ratings?
The polls are consistent, and Harding is at the bottom. There have been, as Professor Farrell said, two polls conducted by Arthur Schlesinger Sr., one in 1948 and one in 1962. Harding was dead last, 29th in the 1948 poll. In the 1962 poll, he was dead last. There have been three large survey polls, and I think they're really important. The first one appeared in the Social Science Quarterly. Gary Marinell was the author of that. It appeared in 1970. It was a poll of 571 historians, and Harding finished 31st of the 31 presidents that were evaluated. Robert Murray, who, if there was a defender of the Harding administration, it was Robert Murray, formerly of Penn State. He conducted a poll that appeared in the Journal of American History in 1983. Murray's poll was 953 historians and political scientists, and Harding finished 36th and dead last. And there was a poll that was done in 1997 in a book by William J. Ridings and Stuart McIver, 719 historians, and Harding was 41st and dead last. And I actually believe that the polls are right.
Why?
This is such a broad group of historians. You're talking about thousands of historians. I don't think Harding was a distinguished individual, and I don't think there were distinguished accomplishments coming out of the administration. And you combine that with scandal, both professional scandal, certainly the Veterans Bureau Teapot Dome, whether Harding knew about it or not, it was his Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, who was the first cabinet officer, I believe, to go to jail for offenses committed while serving in the cabinet. The Veterans Administration scandal, and here you have thousands of historians not reacting to journalists of the 1920s, but looking seriously at this administration and finding that Warren G. Harding is not a distinguished man, and in fact ranks the worst of all the American presidents. And I know Professor Farrell and I disagree on this subject.
Let's get a call from Atlanta concerning Warren G. Harding. Go ahead, please.
I was wondering, had either of the professors recalled that Harding was referred to as a Negro during his time?
Professor Farrell.
May I speak to that? This was the, I won't say calumny, but this was the accusation of a professor at Worcester College named W.G. Chancellor, who was, I think, nothing less than a nut. And Chancellor created some broadsheets that were bruited about at the Chicago Convention in 1920. And then in 1922, he published fugitively a book that he entitled A Biography. This was published in Dayton, Ohio, by an unknown press, in which he made this accusation. He had absolutely no proof there. This was an old account that was heard out in Blooming Grove, and it was the kind of thing you'd hear in the 19th century. I don't think there's any factual basis for that at all.
Melinda Gilpin, if you can speak a little bit more to that, specifically regarding the rumors and the stories and things and discussion that take place in this area in Ohio concerning Warren Harding.
Certainly. Of course, Ohio was not a slave state, and we were a very active Underground Railroad state. However, there were a number of people in Ohio, in central Ohio, as well as throughout the state, who did not approve of the Underground Railroad, the actions of Underground Railroad conductors, or abolitionists themselves. Many of these people, including members of Harding's family, were basically living with these rumors due to their activities prior to the Civil War with the Underground Railroad and assisting slaves who escaped through that means up to Canada and to freedom. Many of the stories that we have here suggest that that rumor was based basically on a great uncle of Mr. Harding's, who was an active conductor on the Underground Railroad. And most of our things do tell us that that's a rumor that many people, particularly abolitionist families, lived with as their relatives who assisted slaves, escaping slaves.
If you are a teacher watching this program around the country, we've got some additional help for you as you prepare your lessons on history. There's a number you can call for C-SPAN in the classroom. First of all, the web address is cspan.org/classroom. The number to call is area code 202-626-4855. and get some more information on our series, American Presidents' Life Portraits, to help you out with lessons. We have a call from Honolulu this morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Professor Murray of Penn State talked about the reputation of Harding, and I received a sheet talking about what he thought when I visited the Harding home in Marion. He pointed at Henry Mencken and Editor White of Emporia as being part of the cause of Harding's reputation being damaged in the late 20s and into the early 30s. Professor Farrell has talked about this a little bit, and probably can talk about it some more. Thank you.
I'd be delighted to answer that one. Harding's reputation was simply attacked in a way that, so I would argue, no other president of the United States has suffered those attacks. I think they were in part because of the coming election of 1924. Harding, of course, died in August 1923. There were people like Mencken who made fun of everything. Mencken, I might point out, voted for Harding in 1920. There were then the journalists, notably a man named Samuel Hopkins Adams, who was a skilled muckraker of the earlier era. There was William Allen White, there was Mark Sullivan, and then a series of, with the exception of the Murray biography, which is the only good biography, I think, of Harding, there were two other books that I think are disgraceful biographies, one by a man named Sinclair and the other by an individual named Francis Russell. Russell's book has almost dominated the field. It was a Book of the Month Club book. And it goes for pages and pages about the so-called Harding scandals, and Harding doesn't appear. And this is one of my favorite topics, and it was the destruction of this career. Together with a book that Samuel Hopkins Adams published in 1926, which was a novel. It sold 100,000 copies. It was about a mythical president, but the president was really Harding. And then Nan Britton's book in 1927, which was, I think, a piece of fiction.
One of the things we like to do during this series of American Presidents' Life Portraits is get a sense for the type of people we're talking about here. What did they sound like? What did they look like? What kind of demeanor did they have? We have some audio clip of Warren G. Harding making a speech. We could at least get an actual listen to exactly what he sounded like. So let's listen in.
I believe in party government as distinguished from personal government. Individual, dictatorial, autocratic, or whatnot. It was the intent of the Founding Fathers to give this republic a dependable and enduring popular government, representative in form, and it was designed to make political parties the effective agencies through which hopes and aspirations and convictions and conscience may be translated into public performance.
Professor Eugene Trani, what kind of communicator do you think Warren G. Harding was?
He was a good communicator. He believed, I think there were two purposes of communication. One was to clarify and the other was to obfuscate at times, and he did both of them well. He could answer very, very completely, but give an answer that really did not have anything to grab onto. I want to go back to the polls for a second, and I hate to keep on focusing on the polls. I think Professor Farrell is dead right that certainly Harding had his critics at the Times in the 1920s and 1930s, but with the outpouring of the Harding literature in the 1960s, when the Harding papers opened, and in fact my first teaching position was at Ohio State University from 1965 to 1967, which was the period of time when the Harding papers opened up, and the publication of the Murray book, you would have expected the reputation of Harding to change for the better. And the one example I could give you is Eisenhower. In the 1962 Schlesinger poll, Eisenhower was ranked 20th. In the 1970 Gary Marino poll, Eisenhower was ranked 20th. A lot of stuff has come out on Eisenhower, and now in the most recent poll by Ridings and McIver, Eisenhower is ranked 9th in the presidential polls. You've seen Eisenhower go up higher and higher and higher. You have seen no change whatsoever on Warren G. Harding. He remains at the bottom no matter what has been published about him. So I would just say that when you're talking about thousands of historians now having at their disposal a lot of material on what went on in the Harding administration, the evaluations are similar to what they were in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s.
Robert Farrell?
I hesitate to disagree with Professor Trani, but my judgment is that most historians do not read the literature of the 1920s. I'm interested in this. Just last year I published a book on Coolidge. My book on Harding, I think, has been read by the Harding buffs, but I have not encountered a single historian, I'm sorry to say, who has read that book. And in fact, one of the political scientists at Indiana University, at the very time I published the book, announced in our alumni magazine that Harding was the worst president. He had never heard of my book. I think many of the polls are answered by historians who do not read the literature. I'm sorry to say this. I'm speaking about my fellow historians, but if you ask them, say, what the three major scandals were of the Harding administration, supposedly, that is the Veterans Bureau, the Teapot Dome, and the Attorney General Dougherty, they could not even name them, not to mention what happened during that period. I think we're speaking about, and I hesitate to say it, professorial ignorance, and there's a lot of it out there.
I'm going to talk more about Man Britain in just a moment, but wanted to ask Melinda Gilpin about those polls and how the museum, the home, the entire town of Marion, to this day, how does it view its president, Harding, in light of all that history and all those polls?
Well, it's an interesting dichotomy. We like Mr. Harding because he did a great job with starting a newspaper in our community. He provided a lot of jobs. He also was a great civic leader and really encouraged new business here in Marion during its industrial development. But we also are very well aware of many of the things that others have written and said about Mr. Harding, some true, some not true. I think one of the things that has been the most difficult is in the school systems. You know, how do you teach the scandals to our students, and how do you try to strike a balance between maybe the mistakes that Mr. Harding made and the really some of the wonderful things that he did here in Marion and during his administration in Washington. But I think as a whole, we see Harding as a very positive person. It's very hard not to listen to all of those stories about what a great guy he was and what a friendly guy he was and how exciting the Front Porch Campaign was here in Marion.
Let's get a call from East Chicago, Indiana. Good morning.
Hi, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the accomplishments of Harding and make the observation that compared to Kennedy, who was in office 5 months longer, Harding rates very well in his accomplishments. Bob Farrell, this is Pete Thayer from Northern Indiana.
Oh, how are you?
Hi. But a few things on Harding. He created the Bureau of the Budget. There was no budgeting in the government prior to that. He proposed and put through a national highway construction project, not done again until Eisenhower. He cut taxes, balanced the budget, and reduced the debt, and brought us out of a recession to a tremendous period of prosperity. Personally, single-handedly, he got major business to go to the 8-hour day, which even Congress couldn't do due to a Supreme Court ruling. He improved our foreign relations with Mexico, Latin, and South America. He built a tremendous cabinet. He showed political courage in vetoing the Veterans Bonus Bill because it simply would raise the national debt by 1/6. He fought for a merchant marine against Congress. He appointed a tremendously strong cabinet, and his judicial appointments were fabulous, including William Howard Taft as Chief Justice. So I think that that, along with his pardoning of Debs, which showed great political courage, shows that the man had a lot of character, a lot of ability, and there was a great deal of positive things that are almost never talked about. His poll ratings, I agree with Professor Farrell totally. He brought the end of Wilson, the Wilson era down in the League of Nations, and he's never been forgiven for that. And if you go to Columbus and check to see who was researched in the papers, you'll find that historians aren't looking at them.
Robert Farrell?
I like that statement very much, and I wish I had written it, but we certainly thank our friend.
Eugene Trani, you want to respond to that comment?
There clearly are accomplishments in the administration. There clearly are strong members of the administration. Two of the strongest members of the administration were Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce, who was much more than a Secretary of Commerce, who had his hands in so many of the accomplishments of the Harding administration, and Charles Evans Hughes, the Secretary of State. Clearly there were strong people, clearly there were accomplishments, but I just think that the overall record is not a distinguished one.
In a couple minutes from now, a reenactment of a Warren G. Harding speech. We have a call in the meantime from Danville, California. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm very impressed with Harding, but coming from Wyoming, I would like somebody to go into the history of the Teapot Dome scandal. I'd never known anything about it. I've seen it, but nobody ever told me. Would you mind talking about it, please?
Eugene Trani, what happened at Teapot Dome?
There have been controversies over a long period of time over the exploitation of the resources of the West. There was a big controversy, the so-called Ballinger-Pinchot controversy early in the century, and it was basically people who wanted to exploit the natural resources versus people who wanted to preserve the natural resources. What Teapot Dome happened to be was a scandal about oil reserves in Wyoming and in California, and the fact that in the end, after a long investigation, it was determined that Harding personally gained from loans from people like Sinclair and Doheny, the heads of large oil companies, while these oil reserves were tapped and exploited. He convinced the Secretary of the Navy, Edwin Denby, and then the President to transfer these leases and then allow these leases to be exploited, the oil to be removed, and at the same time got money personally, and this became a very large scandal. The senator from Montana, Thomas Walsh, was the one who led the charge on this, but it was a larger battle of preservationists, people who wanted to preserve the West, and people who wanted to exploit the natural resources of the West. And then
Robert.
Professor Farrell has wisely pointed out that on this Teapot Dome, that Harding was not in the know on this scandal, and I think that is probably accurate. It was his Secretary of the Interior who was in the Teapot Dome up to his neck and, in fact, went to prison for it.
Robert Fell, you wanted to talk.
If I may say just a word, there were only 5 people who possibly knew about Teapot Dome prior to February 1924, and Harding had died the previous August. One would have been Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, who had by that time resigned. His wife would have known. Doheny, who was a big oil man in California, and probably his wife, and then Harry F. Sinclair. All of us have seen the Sinclair oil stations. No one else knew about this until February of 1924, and Harding could not have known about this. It was the great surprise, you might say the bombshell preceding the election of 1924.
And we have a call from Massachusetts. Is it Waltham?
Yes, yes, it is.
Go ahead.
I was wondering whether President Harding was. I read that he one time somewhere that he got a large percentage of the women's vote in 1920, and whether this could have been a backlash against Woodrow Wilson, since I had seen a documentary on Channel 2, it was The American Experience, where a lot of the suffragists said that Wilson turned a deaf ear to the issue of women's suffrage, that he was very indifferent. And it's also interesting to me that Theodore Roosevelt, who was a Republican at the time and was running in 1912, said that he was for votes for women in his Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party.
Robert Farrell.
I have a comment on that. For a long time, Wilson really did not think that women needed the vote. And every time he made a speech, there was a group of suffragettes who were in Jackson Place, right outside the front of the White House, and they had a fire going, and they burned Wilson's speech in the fire. Eventually, I think the president came around, but he was a bit late on that.
We're going to keep our two professors here, talk to them a bit later, and get to more of your calls a bit later. But right now we want to show you an event that the city of Marion has put together. It is a reenactment of the acceptance speech by Warren G. Harding. We have some archival video first to show you of Harding on the front porch of his house making a speech. The crowds are gathering there. Again, this is back in the early 1920s. Florence and Warren G. Harding there. And again, at the same location this morning in Marion, Ohio, the front porch of the Harding home, a reenactment of a speech from July 22nd, 1920.
The Republican National Convention is over. They've selected, as a result of some conversations in that smoke-filled room, a man by the name of Warren G. Harding to run as the Republican National Standard Bearer. The year 1920, the date at the moment, July 22nd, 1920. Senator Harding, as he campaigned on the front porch, extolled many things that he was going to try to institute. But now that he has been elected by the Republican National Party to carry their torch, he has written a very wonderful acceptance speech, never given here on the front porch, but instead given at the Chautauqua Pavilion on the east side of Marion. So it's my pleasure now to introduce to you the man who will probably be the next President of the United States, Senator Warren Gamaliel Harding. Chairman Lodge, members of the Notification Committee, members of the National Committee, the message which you have formally conveyed brings to me a realization of responsibility which is not underestimated. It is the supreme task to interpret the covenant of a great political party, the activities of which are so woven into the history of this republic, and very sacred and solemn undertaking to utter the faith and the aspirations of many millions who adhere to that party. The party platform has chartered the way. Yet somehow we have come to expect that interpretation which voices the faith of nominees who must assume specific tasks. Let me be understood clearly from the very beginning. I believe in party sponsorship. I believe in party government as distinguished from personal government, individual, dictatorial, or autocratic, or whatnot. In a citizenship of more than 100 million, it is impossible to reach an agreement upon all the questions. Parties are formed by those who reach a consensus of opinion. It was the intent of the Founding Fathers to give this republic a dependable and enduring popular government, representative in form, having sponsorship with the effective agencies bringing about the conscience of those of the public interest. Popular government has been an inspiration of liberty since the dawn of the nation. Republicans have always brought this forth. As republics have risen and fallen, a transition from party to personal government has preceded every failure since the world began. Under the Constitution, we have the chartered way to security and perpetuity. We know it gave to us the safe path to a developing eminence, which no people in the world has ever rallied. It has guaranteed the rule of intelligent, deliberate public opinion expressed through the parties. And under this plan, a masterful leadership becoming that a people's will still remains the supreme authority in our land. The American achievement under the plan of our fathers is nowhere disputed. On the contrary, the American example has been the model of every republic which glorifies the progress of our liberty and is also representative of the leaven of democracy, of human freedom. No man is big enough to run this great republic. There has never been one. Such domination was never intended. Tranquility, stability, dependability are all assured in party sponsorship, and we mean to renew the assurances which were rendered in this cataclysmal war. Our first committal is the restoration of representative government through the Constitution and through the Republican Party. Our vision includes more than just a chief executive. We believe in a cabinet of highest capacity, equal to the responsibilities which our system contemplates, and in whose councils the Vice President, second official of the Republic, shall be asked to participate. The same vision includes a cordial understanding and coordinated activities with the House of Congress, fresh from the people, voicing the convictions which members cooperated along with the public. Its members are the designated sentinels on the towers of constitutional government. It is not difficult, Chairman Lodge, to make ourselves clear on the question of international relationships. We Republicans in the Senate, conscious of our solemn oaths, mindful of our constitutional obligations, when we saw the structure of a world super government taking visionary form, joined in becoming a warning of our devotion to this republic. If the torch of constitutionalism had not been dimmed, the delayed peace of the world and the tragedy and disappointment in Europe's misunderstanding of America easily might have been avoided. The Republicans of the Senate halted the banter of independent American eminence and influenced which it was proposed to exchange for an obscure and unequal place in the merged government. Our party means to hold the heritage of American nationality unimpaired and unsurrendered at all times. The world will not misconstrue, and we do not mean to hold aloof. We do not mean to shun a single responsibility of this republic to world civilization. There is no suspicion, no aversion for any people in the world. We hold to our rights, and we mean to defend all citizens of the United States everywhere in this land. Yet there is a concord of enmity and sympathy and fraternity in every resolution. There is a genuine aspiration in every American breast for tranquil friendship for all the world. We believe the unspeakable sorrows, the immeasurable sacrifices, the awakened convictions, the aspiring conscience of humankind must commit the nations to a new and better understanding. It need not be discussed now what motives plunged the world into war. It need not be inquired whether we ask the sons of this republic to go to war, as I believe that we did, to purge the old world of accumulated ills and rivalry and greed. Their sacrifices will be in vain if we cannot acclaim a new order with added security to civilization and peace maintained. One may readily sense the conscience of America. I am sure I understand the purpose of the dominant group of the Senate. We were not seeking to defeat world aspiration. We were resolved to safeguard America. It must always be America first. In this coming administration, America first. We were resolved then, even as we are resolved now and will be tomorrow, to preserve this free and independent republic. Let those now responsible or seeking responsibility propose the surrender, whether through interpretations or apologies or reluctant reservations from which our rights are to be omitted. We welcome the referendum to the American people on the preservation of America. And the Republican Party pledges its defense to preserve our inheritance as a national country, as national freedom. This republic can never be unmindful of its power and must never forget the force of its example. Possessor of might that admits no fear, if the mistaken voice of America spoke in unheeding haste, led Europe in the hour of deepest anxiety into a military alliance which menaces peace and threatens all freedom, instead of adding to their security, then we must speak the truth for America and express our hope as a conscience of this country. It will avail nothing to discuss in detail the League Covenant, which was conceived for world supergovernment, negotiated in misunderstanding, intolerably urged and demanded by its administration sponsors, who resisted every effort to safeguard America, and who finally rejected it when such safeguards were inserted. If men can call for specific details on this, I remind them of the moral commitments which are broad and all-inclusive, and we are contemplating peoples in concord with humanity's advancement. From our own viewpoint, the program is specifically American, and we mean to be American first to all the world. Appraising preserved nationality as the first essential to the continued progress of this great republic, which is linked to the supreme necessity of the restoration, let us say, the revealment of the Constitution and the transcending task of the Constitution. Its concerns are the common will here at home, will decide our future eminence in relationship to the world. And more than this, the republic, under the conditions of the Constitution, will give to humanity the attainment that the world has never had. The chief trouble today is the world war has wrought the destruction of healthful competition, left our storehouses empty, and there is a minimum in production instead of maximum. Maximums, not minimums, is the call for America today. It is not a new story, because war never fails to leave depleted storehouses, always impairs the efficiency of production. War also establishes a higher standard of wages, and they now abide. And I wish the higher wage to abide on one explicit condition, that the wage earner will give full return for the wages received. It is the best assurance that we can have for a reduced cost of living in this country. Mark you, I am ready to acclaim the highest standard of pay, but I would be blind to the responsibility that marked this fateful hour if I did not caution the wage earners of America that mounting wages and decreased production can only lead to industrial and economic ruin. I want somehow to appeal to the sons and to the daughters of this republic, to every producer, to join hand in brain in this republic in production, more production, honest production, patriotic production, because patriotic production is no less a defense of our country as the best civilization in the world than that of armed force. We must work our most and our best, else the destructive actions will come. We must stabilize and strive for normalcy. Thus, the inevitable reaction will bring its train of sufferings and disappointments and reversals. We want to forestall all such reaction. We want to hold all the advanced ground. We want to fortify it with the general good fortune of this country. The human element must always come first. And I want the employers in industry to understand the aspirations, the convictions, the yearnings of millions of Americans across this land, And I want the wage earners to understand the problems, the anxieties, the obligations of management and capital. And all of them must understand their relationship as a people and their obligation to this great republic. Out of this understanding will come unanimous committal to economic justice, and in economic justice lies that social justice which is the highest essential in human happiness. It would be blindness of folly to ignore the activities right now in our own country, which are aimed to destroy our economic system and commit us to the colossal tragedy which has both destroyed and made Russia impotent. This movement is not to halt in any way the freedoms that we have, to abridge the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, or the freedom of religion and assembly, because there is no promise in repression of these freedoms. These liberties are as sacred as the freedom of religious beliefs. We do hold to the right, though, to crush sedition, to stifle a menacing contempt of law, to stamp out the peril to the safety of this republic. When emergency calls, we will be there for anyone who threatens the destruction of this government by force or flaunts his contempt for lawful authority. Let us call all the people of this great land for thrift and economy, for denial and sacrifice, if need, for a nationwide drive against the extravagance of luxury, to a recommitment of the simplicity of living, to that prudent and normal plan of life, which is the health of this republic. There is a plan of life to bring us about a good recovery from war. Give us the assurance of that rugged simplicity of American life which marked the first century with amazing development. And this generation will write a second century of surprising accomplishment for the upcoming generations. The Republican Party was founded by farmers with the sensitive conscience born of their freedom and their simple lives. These founders sprang from the farms of the then Mideast. Our party has never failed in its relationship that agriculture is essential to the foundation of our very existence, and it has never been the policy or the purpose or the performance, but to protect and promote farming as an essential industry in our country. New conditions, which attended amazing growth and extraordinary industrial development, call now for a new and forward-looking program for the farmers. The American farmer had 120 million people to feed. And they heard the cry of the world for food. And our farmers in this country answered that cry. They have come through. In the rise of price levels, there have come increased appraisals to his acres, without adding to their value in fact, but which do add to his taxes and his expenses. And a lot of his helpers have been lured out of the farm and out of the country into the shop and into the city until almost alone the farmers have met the hardships on the farms and attempted to increase the prices of farm productivity, which continues to plummet. It challenges both the recall, that they were effective almost solely against the products in his hands as a producer, and never effective against the same products in passing on to the consumer. Contemplating the defenselessness of the individual farmer to meet organized buyers of his products and distributors are the things that we plan to do in this administration, to elevate the farmer once again to the level where he should be. I believe in the budget system that will be effective in helping the Reformation and reveal business methods and government business. I believe that we need to take government and take government out of business. And then we need to take business and put business back into government. because government has no place in our businesses as a nation. I believe the federal departments should be made more businesslike. They need to send back to productive effort thousands of federal employees who are either duplicating work or not essential at all. I believe in the protective tariff and the protective tariff policy of our country. I believe in a strong United States merchant marine. And I believe that this republic should be the leading maritime nation on this globe. I believe in a Navy that is ample enough to protect our merchant marine and to protect our country. I believe in a small army, but the best army in the world. I believe in established standards of immigration which are connected with the future citizenship of the republic, not with mere manpower and industry. I believe that every man who dons the garb of American citizenship and walks in the light of American opportunity must become American in heart and in soul. I believe in holding fast to every forward step and unshackling our child labor, elevating the conditions of women in the employment field. I believe the federal government should stamp out lynching in this country and remove that stain from the fair name of America. And I believe that the Negro citizens of America should be guaranteed the enjoyment of all their rights, and that they have earned the full measure of citizenship bestowed, and that their sacrifices in blood on the battlefields of this republic have entitled the Negroes of America all the freedom, all the opportunity, all the sympathy, and all the aid of the American spirit of fairness and justice demands. I believe in law enforcement. If elected president, I mean to be a constitutional president. And it is impossible to ignore the Constitution. Unthinkable to evade the law when our every committal is to the orderly government. People ever will differ about the wisdom of the enactment of a law. There is divided opinion today representing the 18th Amendment and the laws enacted to make it operative. But there can be no difference of opinion about honest law enforcement. And ladies, as I address you, the womanhood of America, always its glory, inspiration, and potent uplifting force in the social and spiritual development is about to be able to vote. Wonderful. Long overdue. Insofar as Congress can go, the fact is already accomplished by party edict, by my recorded vote, by my personal conviction. I am committed to this measure of justice. It is my earnest hope and my sincere desire that the one needed state vote be quickly recorded in the affirmation of the right of equal suffrage, and that the vote of every citizen shall be cast and counted in the approaching election of this coming election, and that women will be able to vote for the first time. Let us not share the apprehensions of many men and women as to the danger of this momentous extension of women voting. Women have never been without influence in our political life. Enfranchisement will bring to the polls the votes of citizens who have been born upon our soil, who have been brought up in our educational system. They've been trained in our customs and habits of thoughts and sharers of our problems. It will be the alert mind, the awakened conscience, the sure intuition, the abhorrence of tyranny or oppression, the wide and tender sympathy that will distinguish the women of America. And surely, men, there can be no danger there. And to the great number of noble women who oppose in conviction this tremendous change, in the ancient relation of the sexes as applied to government, I venture to plead that they will accept the full responsibility of enlarged citizenship and give to the Republic their best and their brightest. Much has been said of late about world ideas, but I prefer to think of the ideal for America. I like to think that there is something more than patriotism and the practical wisdom of the Founding Fathers. It is good to believe that maybe destiny held this new world republic to be the supreme example of which humanity is inspired to higher achievement. But it is idle to think that we have attained perfection. But there is the satisfying knowledge that we hold orderly processes for making our government reflect the heart and the mind of the Republic. Ours is not only a fortunate people, but a very commonsensical people, with vision high, with their feet on the earth, and with belief in themselves and faith in God. And whether enemies threaten from without or menaces arise from within, there is some indefinable voice saying, have confidence in the Republic. America will go on. Have confidence in the Republic. America will go on. Have confidence in the Republic. America will go on. Here is the temple of liberty that no storms may shake. Here are the altars of freedom that no passion shall destroy. It was American in its conception, American in its building, and it shall be American in its fulfillment. Sectional once, we are all Americans now, and we mean to be all Americans to all the world once and for all. We are America. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my countrymen all, I would not be my natural self if I did not utter my consciousness of my limited ability to meet your expectations or to realize the aspirations within my own breast. But I will gladly give all that is in me, all of my heart, all of my soul, all of my mind and my abiding love to this country, to service in our common cause. I can only pray to the omnipotent God that I might be as worthy in service as I am faithful of thought and purpose. Mindful then of these vast responsibilities, I must be humble, for I have confidence in the consideration and in the support of all true Americans, which makes me wholly unafraid. With faith and with a hopeful spirit, with a hymn of service in my heart, I pledge fidelity to my country and to God, and I accept the nomination of the Republican Party for the presidency of the United States of America. God bless America! God bless America!
Harding, lead the GOP. Harding, on to victory. We're here to make a fuss. Mr. Harding, you're the man for us. Harding, Coolidge is your mate. Harding, lead the ship of state. You'll get the people's vote, and you'll also get the donkey's goat.
Here in Marion, Ohio, singing a song performed by entertainer Al Jolson during the Front Porch Campaign of 1920. As we continue with our series, American Presidents, Life Portraits, the 29th President, Warren G. Harding, will Invite our viewers across the country to phone in with their questions and comments about Warren G. Harding, perhaps react to the reenactment of the speech. In the Eastern and Central time zones, the number to call is 202-624-1111. Out west, 202-624-1115. We'll get to your calls in just a couple minutes. I want to speak first to a teacher here in Marion, Ohio, Shannon Morris. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. What are the most important things you want students to know as you teach them the history of Mr. Harding?
Well, I think Mr. Harding was very much of a common man. We often speak about that in learning about history, looking for the common man in America to become something better and move on. And Mr. Harding, I think, exemplifies that. He was a newspaper man in a small town that rose to the highest office in America, and I think there's a lesson there for all students and actually adults as well.
And what about accomplishments?
Well, he accomplished a lot. He held the first Arms Limitations Treaty talk. He also formed the Bureau of the Budget. He was very instrumental in starting many different items that we have today that we just take for granted now. And Mr. Harding, I think through history has been a little bit ignored, and that's unfortunate.
We've also been talking about some of the more negative aspects of Warren G. Harding, his life and his presidency, the polls that rank him near or at the bottom. How do you handle here in Marion, where he's from, the negative aspects? How do you teach that?
Well, that's always very difficult. Of course, I'm a foreign language teacher, and I'm not exactly aware of how the history teachers teach it here. But I know from working here at the Harding home that many of those stories were perhaps unfounded. And history through the years, you always have to deal with what people's opinions are, and sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But I think we need to focus on the positive of Mr. Harding, and there were a lot of positives that get ignored, unfortunately.
Shannon Morris is a teacher at Marion Harding High School here in Ohio. Yes. Thank you, and we're going to ask you to point us out a couple of students because we know we want to talk to a couple of students during this segment.
All right, we have Sarah Edwards and Kyle Bogan.
Why don't you guys come on down? Let me get your name again.
Sarah Edwards.
And what grade are you in?
I'm a senior at Marion Harding High School.
What was your reaction, your reflection on the speech?
I thought it was very well written, very articulate. I thought it put out some very good goals for any president to try and strive to.
How much have you learned about Warren Harding through your years in school?
Actually, not as much as I've learned by just being here today. We've studied his administration a little bit through government, and we know, of course, since we go to Marion Harding High School, we know a little bit about just his campaign, but more of the things that I've actually learned have been through here. I know about the Limited Arms Treaty talk. I know about the fact that he was the 29th president and that his service was terminated by his death in 1923.
Thank you very much for helping us this morning and with the song. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And let me get your name.
Kyle Bogan. I'm a senior at Marion Harding High School.
What do you know about Warren G. Harding?
Once again, just like Sarah had said, most of what we know has come from our visit today. One of the things that I know is that the Harding Memorial here in Marion is one of the largest presidential monument outside of Washington, D.C. And also, as far as connecting it with Harding High School, we have a scholarship called the Kling Scholarship, and that is from Mrs. Harding's niece actually started that, and it goes to a student who is going to pursue a career in medicine or music because Mr. Harding was very into medicine, his family was into medicine, and Mrs. Harding really enjoyed music.
Now, how old are you?
I am 17, almost 18.
What is your sense as a 17-year-old of the importance of studying history?
Very important. I feel that we can learn from our history, and we learn from our mistakes, and we learn from our successes. And by studying history, we can go on to a more brighter future.
Thank you as well for your time. Appreciate your help. I want to talk to Ken Hammondtree in just a moment. He performed the reenactment of the speech by Warren G. Harding. Take a couple calls first, though. Reaction to the reenactment of the speech. Bolsher, Louisiana is our first call. Go ahead.
My question is more about, I enjoyed hearing that, but I'm very curious about Albert Bacon Fall. I became very interested in him, and I feel like he had a very raw deal. I read a monograph by David Stratton, and he comes off as a very sympathetic character in the monograph. And apparently the United States had fears of Japanese expansion at that time, and since it was the war, everything was, they cut back on things, and he arranged the deals with the oil company in order to get supply depots built in Hawaii for the United States Navy. And as I said, I just feel like what the gentlemen professors might have to say about that.
Thank you for calling. Let me ask Robert Farrell. He is back over at our set. Did you listen to that caller?
Yes, I did, indeed.
Can you help us with that?
Oh, yes, I can. Albert B. Fall was a Kentuckian who migrated down to New Mexico and then became senator when New Mexico became a state. In 1921-22, when this money was offered to him, he thought it was a loan, and that's what he said. But it was an enormous amount of money for the time. It was about $400,000. It came from Sinclair and Doheny, who were two oil men, and they did not, I think, consider it as a loan. They considered it as a way of influencing this fellow to get these to get this oil, and Fall was simply mistaken in that, and of course he lived on for years thereafter, and he wished I think he hadn't done it, but it seems to me that he took the money and he should have taken the consequences, which indeed he had to do. He went to jail.
Let's get a call from Sacramento, California. Hello.
Yeah, there was a lot of anti-immigration sentiment at the time. I was wondering what Harding's position was on immigration and whether he or the people around him were at all influenced by the eugenics movement.
Let's address that question to Professor Eugene Trani down in Richmond. Immigration at that time. Set the stage for us.
Well, you heard it in the speech. Harding was for America first, returning the country to normalcy. There were a lot of concerns about immigration. There were a lot of concerns that exhibited themselves in the last year of the Wilson administration in the so-called Great American Red Scare. And there was a movement to put quotas on immigrants, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. And in fact, that was the major change in immigration legislation. And Harding was clearly supportive of that in the sense that he too shared the concerns that there were too many immigrants in the United States, and they were introducing ideas, suspicious ideas, dangerous ideas. I found the speech to be very interesting because he also nibbled around the edges of Bolshevism, of socialism, and its implication for the United States. So quite clearly, Harding was concerned with a lot of the immigrants who had come to the United States in the late 1890s, in the first 15 years of the 20th century.
We will get to more of your calls in the next few minutes, but first we wanted to talk with Ken Hammontree. He's the gentleman who you just saw reenact the speech from President Warren G. Harding. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
Tell us about preparation. How do you get ready for something like this?
It took me about 4 months to read about every book I could get my hands on Harding, and then go over the speech. I really didn't want to memorize the speech because he never really would have memorized it, and just to get the gist of the speech. And then, of course, how you see me dressed here, took a little research, and about 4 or 5 months of research in Harding to prepare for today.
And the white pants, dark top. Tell us more.
Well, as you see President Harding standing here, or President, hopefully to be president in the coming election, this, of course, was brought about by my wife, the Duchess, and, of course, she wants me to stand out in the crowd, and I don't believe you see anybody in the crowd today that has white pants or cream-colored pants, and hopefully that will set me apart from the crowd.
Tell us more about the mannerisms, the demeanor, the character. How do you get into that?
Well, with Harding, we do have video of Harding, black and white, and of course silent, but that gave me a real good idea of my hand movements and how he would use his facial expressions, and I took advantage of that. and also listening to some of his speeches, which we have recorded, also was a help.
We will talk more in a couple minutes. We'll keep you around here on the famous front porch of the Harding home. Also, our two professors are going to stay with us for the rest of the program, as well as Melinda Gilpin, who'll be joining us again a little bit later from inside the Harding home. Time for some more calls as we continue to talk about Warren G. Harding, our 29th president. Bakersfield, California, you're up.
Yes, this is Betty Cook. I'm a retired history teacher from high school. We do have a record from Harding's inaugural address, which my father-in-law thought we were related to President Harding, has collected. But my question is mainly a genealogy on the Klings. Now, President Harding's wife was Florence Kling. I have researched it and realized she didn't have a sister. Our Cook family is married to Louisa Kling. Is there anyone I could do more research with for Louisa? She married Cook, which is spelled K-O-C-H, in Mansfield, Ohio, and then moved to Kitchener, Canada.
Robert Farrell?
I don't really know much about that. I wish I did, but Melinda perhaps does.
I don't know if my mic's on. I can try to answer that.
I think we
for
can hear you, yeah.
I have spoken with this caller before, and we are still trying to find any connection to the Louisa Kling that she mentions and the Cook, K-O-C-H family that she mentions. We have not been able to find a relationship with that as of yet, but we still do have some documents that we can attempt to locate and see if we can find some more on that for her. But at this point, we have not been able to find any type of a match for her with the Kling family. And I must say that the Kling family genealogy is much different and much tougher to track than the Harding genealogy, which is fairly well set out.
Tell us more about other descendants of that family who may still be around today.
Well, there are a number of Harding family descendants left, and most of them are physicians. They did tend to keep in the medical practice just as Mr. Harding's father did. Mr. Harding himself never considered the medical profession. He maintained his journalist interests. But many of the family members that are currently still living in Ohio and around the country have chosen the medical profession.
Back to the phones regarding Warren G. Harding, Madison, Wisconsin. Thanks for calling.
Hi, I'm calling. Herbert Hoover has written that on Harding's last journey to Alaska, that the president was in a state of great anxiety, that he couldn't sleep, and he had a lot on his mind. And I was wondering if your professors had a little bit more insight into that. Thank you.
Professor Trani, can you take us through that period?
Well, in fact, during that voyage that Hoover later recounted that Harding raised the issue of what should he do if he knew about scandals, and Hoover recommended that the president step forward and at least get credit for stepping forward in terms of the scandals. But Hoover later said that Harding never unburdened himself completely, telling Secretary of Commerce Hoover what exactly he was talking about.
Springfield, Illinois.
Yes. Are you
Go
there?
ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
I've visited several of the other presidents' homes. I've never been to Marion, but I've visited quite a few other presidents' homes. And I really enjoy the series. Even presidents that I've read their biographies and I've been to their homes, I still learn something from the show.
We appreciate your comments. Let's move on to Riverside, California, our next call. Morning.
Good morning. My name is William Hayes, and my cousin, Will H. Hayes, was Postmaster General under Warren Harding. And our genealogy, we kind of get lost a couple generations back. And I'm wondering if Mr. Farrell, Mr. Trani, or Ms. Gilpin could give me a little history on how Will H. Hayes was selected as Postmaster General. We know that he did resign during the scandals in the Harding administration and became the well-known censor, Old Mr. Scissors, in Hollywood. And I was wondering if they might be able to shed some light on how he became Postmaster General, and I have some background on him.
Robert Farrell?
He was chairman of the National Committee, and it was traditional for the chairman to have that post, and so he almost naturally inherited it. I think, unfortunately, in 1922, he decided he would like to have a large salary, and I think it was $150,000. Your auditors, your viewers would be interested that the average salary in the United States, say in that time, was $1,500, maybe even less than that. My father maybe made $2,000. $150,000 was big money, and Will Hayes took it.
Speaking of money, Melinda Gilpin, how did Warren G. Harding earn his fortune?
Well, Mr. Harding was the publisher of the daily newspaper here in Marion, the Marion Star. He purchased that in 1884, purchased the Marion Daily Pebble and renamed it the Marion Star. Later on, he also opened a printing business in the Star printing offices and took out printing jobs and made money that way as well. But I think the best way that he really made money was through the business sense of his wife, Florence Kling. He was running a fairly successful newspaper at the time he married. As soon as they married, Miss Kling went on as the circulation director of the Marion Star. It's she that introduced home delivery of the newspaper to Marion. It is she that recruited all of the newsboys and started with a limited circulation. People used to, before her, they had to go to the newspaper office to pick up their daily paper. But Miss Kling was a very well-educated businesswoman. She was the first child of her family, and her father was extremely disappointed that she was a girl. So he decided then and there to raise her as a boy. He taught her business, he taught her finance, he taught her running an inventory, running retail, also being a landowner. He would take her with him when he collected rents and worked with all of the people who rented property from him. So I think really in many ways, Mrs. Harding can be credited with a lot of the financial success of the couple. Not to say that he wasn't successful before, but she certainly was a great enhancement to their business and their partnership as a marriage.
We are still here with Ken Hammontree, the gentleman who did the reenactment of the Warren Harding speech. I'll ask you a little bit about the great crowds that were here in those days. Some people say 20, 25,000 on this very spot. Hate to turn our back to the camera, but if you can point out and explain, as a performer, as the president, how would he have projected his voice without special equipment?
Well, first of all, as you can see, we have some homes across the street here. The street would have been closed. There might have been crowds as small as maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people, or maybe up to 15,000 or 20,000 people. And of course, back then they did not have the means that we do today to amplify the voice. And Harding would practice projecting, and his voice was so powerful, and I hope I displayed that in the speech, that he could project across, and the voice would bounce back across the street from the homes. He was a tremendous speechwriter and a very, very great interpreter of the speech. He gave good speeches.
Now, you run a small operation company called Living History Productions. What does that mean?
Living History Productions, basically I do about 20 different historical characters across the United States. I portray anybody from George Washington, Paul Revere, General Dwight David Eisenhower, Tecumseh, Blue Jacket, Meriwether Lewis, and President Harding.
Why do you do it?
Well, I used to teach, taught Ohio history, American history, government, and I found out by dressing up and going into the classroom and portraying George Washington as we studied the Revolutionary War, the children just loved it, and that was the beginnings of Living History Production.
Thanks again for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Back to the phones. Warren G. Harding, Washington, D.C. Hello.
Yes. How are you doing this morning?
Doing fine.
Yeah, I want to raise a question about Warren G. Harding's African ancestry. I noticed it hadn't been discussed today. Some years ago in Parade magazine, I read an article or a news story, I guess you'd say, this talked about Warren G. Harding's African ancestry. So I'd like for someone today to discuss that. And why isn't Warren G. Harding then classified as the first known African-American president?
Actually, caller, it is something we touched upon earlier, but since it's a 3-hour program, we'll review the issue again for you and ask Melinda Gilpin to do it for us. Did you hear the question?
Yes, I did. I think that we did try to make it clear earlier that it's fairly certain that there was no African American ancestry to Mr. Harding. However, his family was they were very advocate abolitionists. They worked on the Underground Railroad, and he had an uncle who was quite a very active conductor on the Underground Railroad. Many people in Ohio during that time, some were pro-slavery, some were abolitionists. Many of the pro-slavery people started rumors about people who worked on the Underground Railroad, were conductors on the Underground Railroad, and were prominent abolitionists, that there was African American ancestry in their families. We pretty much can say now that the Harding family genealogy is fairly well set clear back to their emigration to this country from Europe, and we do not see any African American ancestry in it. It's something that a lot of families lived with prior to the Civil War who were abolitionists and willing to take action for their beliefs.
Professor Robert Farrell, how did politician and President Warren G. Harding feel toward blacks?
He really didn't do a whole lot. He made a speech in Birmingham in October of 1921. The speech was to a segregated audience, and he said the right things, except he said one wrong thing, namely that it would be impossible for the two races to have any kind of society together. But then he didn't follow up upon it. The American leadership of the of the NAACP had a program, and Harding really didn't pursue what he said in Birmingham or the black program. He just didn't do very much, and I think we have to say that.
We have a caller from Morgantown, West Virginia this morning. Hello. Hello, Morgantown.
I want to thank you for this program. Add my thanks to the many people who've called in. The next thing, I want to thank you because it allows us to see the historians. My experience over the years has been not to believe the history until you know the historians. This is absolutely an excellent program for that. Thirdly, Mr. Harding seemed like a good man of whom a lot of people took advantage, and he just did not know how to crack the whip. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go out to California. Is it Palos Verde?
Hello, my name is Bill. I want to say first that I enjoy watching your program, and I've been watching all of them, and I think they're very enlightening and educational.
Thank you.
My question is, in view of the scandals in the Harding administration compared today in the scandals in the Clinton administration, do you think that later, when the historians review the Clinton administration, they may revise the rating of President Harding, because at present he's rated at the bottom of the list of effective presidents?
Professor Eugene Trani down in Richmond, you've spoken a lot about the polls. What do you make of a question like that?
I think it's a very good question. Obviously, there are some similarities in the fact that Clinton has both suffered personal scandals as well as scandals in his administration, cabinet members being forced to resign and some cabinet members pleading guilty to certain offenses. I think, however, you have major differences between the administrations. You obviously have a president who will have served 8 years and been reelected. Harding, because of his death, did not serve 8 years and was not reelected. You have unparalleled prosperity during the Clinton administration. You almost have to take a look at the Harding-Coolidge administration to get a comparable feel for the 8-year period of the Clinton period. But clearly the scandals bring some similarities, and then you'll have to be doing comparisons. What is the significance of the Washington Naval Conference versus peace efforts in the Middle East? Or you'll have to look at the accomplishments and the difficulties of the Clinton administration versus the Harding administration. But clearly you are doing, C-SPAN, Paul and your colleagues are doing a great service by getting more information out on all the presidents And if Professor Farrell is right, if historians do take time, they will see the accomplishments of the Harding administration in a much improved light, and the scandals in a much diminished light. To date, that has not happened.
Well, we have about an hour's worth of information ahead live here in Marion, Ohio, as we continue with our series, American Presidents, Life Portraits. The 29th President, Warren G. Harding. I'm going to take a brief time out and then come back with more of your calls and more discussion. But first, we want to take a look at a tape of two older residents here in Marion who were actually at this spot in 1920 for the front porch campaign of President Harding, and we'll hear what they had to say as they remember that campaign.
I was only 4 years old, but I remember it so very well. We had had a family crisis, and Mother couldn't bring me, but she felt it was so important that I participate in this historic event that she enlisted the aid of the neighbors. And Mrs. Snyder had 5 kids, so one more didn't make any difference. So I came with the Snyders. And I remember the crowd and how they pressed in. And finally, Mrs. Snyder said, "Now I think we should shake hands with the future president." And she lifted me up to shake hands. And I was really frightened. But I looked up into Mr. Harding's face, and it was so kind that suddenly I just wasn't afraid at all. And he took my little hand in his great big hand and shook it, and it's something I never forgot.
Mr. Metz, your remembrances of that time?
Well, I was about 10, 12 years old when Harding started his campaign right here on the porch. And my folks brought me over here. Of course, I couldn't drive at that time, so they brought me over here to see him, see, and everything like that, see. And so he stood right here, and guys, big shots, Harvey Firestone and Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, I think, was one of them, came to see Harding. And he got started, see, they had a Republican convention in Chicago, and them guys couldn't decide on a candidate. And Harding was a lieutenant governor of the state of Ohio, and then somebody mentioned him. And so they said, well, I think he'd be all right. Nobody knows him, and he wouldn't have any enemies, so he'd be a good candidate. And he was. He got here on the front porch, and every guy that mounted anything came to talk to him, see him.
We need a man to guide us, who'll always be beside us, a man who is a fighter through and through, a man who'll make the White House shine out like a lighthouse. And Mr. Harding, we've selected you. So it's Harding, lead the GOP. Harding, on to victory. We're here to make a fuss. Warren Harding, you're the man for us. We know we'll always find you with Coolidge right behind you, and Coolidge never failed, you must agree. We know he will be guarding the nation just like Harding when you are both in Washington, D.C. So it's Harding, lead the GOP. Harding, on to victory. We're here to make a fuss. Warren Harding, you're the man for us. Warren Harding,
We've been listening to folk singer Oscar Brand's rendition of Harding, You're the Man for Us, as we examine the life of Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States. And we are live today from Marion, Ohio, and the home of President Harding and his wife, Florence. Phone numbers on the bottom of the screen. Once again, we welcome your calls, your questions, comments on Warren G. Harding. 202-624-1111 in the Eastern and Central time zones, 202-624-1115 out west. And we're going to go back now to Melinda Gilpin, who runs the historic site here at the Harding home in Marion, Ohio. Tell us more about Hollywood, about entertainment. We heard Oscar Brand, we heard a song from Al Jolson. What was the connection there in 1920?
Well, Harding was a very interesting candidate. His wife was a very good image management consultant, you might say. She suggested that it might be a good idea for him to talk to some popular entertainers that he knew and suggest that they endorse his candidacy. Harding was the first president who did that. As a matter of fact, he was the first president to bring popular entertainers. He brought them right here to Marion. They would speak on his behalf right off the front porch and encourage people to vote for him. So the entertainment connection was also part of his way of life. He was a musician. He played cornet as well as a lot of other instruments. And his wife, of course, had a degree in music from the Cincinnati Conservatory and was quite a piano player.
And talk more about his wife, Florence Harding, and use the house while you're doing that to tell us more about who she was, what she liked to do, what she was like.
Well, I think she was quite a woman who loved to entertain people. This house has quite a lot of her fingerprints on it, you might say. Even though this was built during their engagement, she was one of the biggest influences on what was in the house. A great example is the fireplace behind me. We have 3 fireplaces in the home. They're all found on the first floor. They share a common chimney. This is the original rookwood tile that Mrs. Harding selected from Cincinnati for her fireplace. All 3 of them still have their original rookwood tiles. Mrs. Harding loved animals, and as I proceed over here to the stairwell, I'll show you one of the things that she considered and requested specifically for the house. If you look on the pillar on the diagonal, you might see the face of the owl that we find here on this particular stairway pillar. She loved animals and wanted that to be reflected in her home. She'd seen this elsewhere and specifically asked that it be included in her house.
We will look further through the home of the Hardings as the next hour goes on, but we will go back to the phones now. Long Branch, New Jersey, you're up.
Yes, good morning. I'm interested in talking to Robert Farrell. He mentioned some books that about Harding, and then there's been some comments about a scandal and his approach to Herbert Hoover about what to do about certain things. I have in my possession here a book called The President's Daughter by Nan Britton. And she is the mother of Elizabeth Ann, the child of Warren Harding. And the house in which the child was born still exists today in Asbury Park, New Jersey. A friend of mine owns it, 1210 Bond Street in Asbury Park, where Elizabeth Ann was born in, I think, 1919. But I was wondering if you ever read the book and wonder what he thought about it.
Robert Farrell, the story of Nan Britton.
The story of Nan Britton. This was a woman who was born in 1896 in Clarendon, which is 5 or 6 miles to the east of Marion. Quite early, her father and mother and the other children moved into Marion. She then stayed in Marion and went to high school. Her English teacher was Warren Harding's sister. And then after some moves, she went to New York. She did do 2 books. One was published in 1927 in which she asserted, I say without proof, I've read the book thoroughly. I have looked into every possible detail in that book, and she has no proof. This child, whom she named Elizabeth Ann Harding, born, that's true, in New Jersey in 1919. She's now living in Oregon. She would be 80 years old. The book is, I think, a piece of fiction, and I would be glad to go into that if we have time. There was another book that she published in 1932, which was mainly about how she published the first book, but it's a tawdry and money-filled story, and in some part believable. She did exchange letters with Harding's sister, but as for Harding letters, no. And I say no proof.
Professor Eugene Trani, you talked extensively about the polls. How much do you suspect the low poll rankings of Warren G. Harding had to do with personal scandal, the affairs, rather than the political?
I think it's clearly part of it. Professor Farrell says there is no proof. In the first book, she talked about letters from Harding. They do not exist. But it's interesting that there was at least one other major affair that Harding had with Carey Phillips, a long-time affair, and those letters do exist. Now, those letters are sequestered with the court putting an opening date, and I believe it's 2014, and they're pretty graphic letters that were discovered as the Harding papers were being opened, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2014 when those letters become public. From Harding to Mrs. Phillips as to whether they are very similar to the letters that Nan Britton alleges that Senator and then President Harding sent to her, and then what happens in 2014 to Harding's reputation when those letters become public.
Robert Farrell, do you want to jump in on that?
Yes, I would. There are 98 of these letters, and they were found in a locked closet in Carey Phillips's house after she had gone to a nursing home. This was around 1956 or 57. They do exist. They are now in the Library of Congress. There's some film on this. But I must say that some of those letters have been published in Carl Anthony's book last year. Carl Anthony violated a court order by publishing those letters. He could be sued. He found those in galley proof out in, of all places, Wyoming. I don't think those letters amount to anything. I don't see much difference between what happened with Harding. The affair began, that is, with Carey Phillips in 1905. It ended in 1915. And what's the difference between that and what happened with Grover Cleveland and Maria Halpin? The only difference was that Cleveland was not married. It is, I think, a blot, perhaps. I would perhaps not call it that, on Harding's reputation. But the letters, as printed in the Anthony book, don't say much.
Let's get a call from San Diego.
I wanted to read a sentence from a book on Clifford Odets, written by Margaret Brennan Gibson. It gives a sentence about President Harding. The Odetses look like any optimistic American family in the early 1920s, which, having repudiated the intellectual President Wilson and his war, was now at ease with Warren Gamaliel Harding, a card-playing, small-town sport of a president, who was repudiated to be a philanderer with a bungalow mind, but who, as Odette said, inspired confidence because he looked like a president. And I had a question, too. There's a book by George Seldes, and it talks about the gang in Ohio, the Ohio gang, and how, in appreciation for getting Harding elected, something about they brought in whiskey from Canada for medicinal purposes and carloads of it, and I was curious if they would comment on that.
Either of our guests can handle that?
I'd be glad to say something.
Go ahead.
The so-called Ohio gang, according to Robert Murray's book, which I think is the best of the biographies by far, was really a creation of our friends who were looking toward victory in 1924. I'm ashamed to say I'm speaking of the Democratic Party. And it didn't exist, but it appealed to people. The idea of a gang, the idea of bootleg liquor, and all these stories. Rumor, really, that's what you're talking about. And rumor always surrounds the presidency, even today.
Professor Trani, that caller mentioning drinking, this was a period of prohibition. How did Warren Harding handle that issue as a senator and president? And did he drink himself?
He quite clearly did drink, and quite clearly, from every account, he drank in the White House, though by 1923, both Mrs. Harding and he had become concerned about that, the president violating a national law. And I think that again contributes to his low reputation. But by 1923, even he had become concerned about playing poker and drinking in the White House.
If I may say something on that, one of the great spreaders of rumors about Harding's drinking was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who had reason to spread such rumors because her husband, Nick, was an alcoholic. Alice had no real proof, so far as I can see, and there is proof to the opposite. I think it was Mark Sullivan one time who said to Harding that he wanted a drink, and Harding had to go in a coat closet and go way into the back and fish out some bottle. And he would do that once in a while, but that was a rather common occurrence in the 20s.
We have a call from Cardington, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a two-part question. First question has to deal with, recently I was watching on the History Channel, the 20th Century, hosted by Mike Wallace, and was dealing with the Ku Klux Klan. And they had a historian on there that alleged that Harding was part of the Ku Klux Klan. He was inducted to the KKK while he was president during a big rally there in the early 20s. And the second part to go along with that is, if either the professors feel that Harding's ever going to get a fair shake at history the way he's judged, to me it seems like he's always getting a bad hand dealt to him. Nothing's ever been truly said fair about him or about his administration.
Robert Farrell?
I looked into that. There was a book published in 1989 by a man at the University of Vermont who claimed to have all sorts of things that historians didn't know about, and one of them was that Harding was inducted in the White House in a great ceremony into the KKK. His source was a roll of film in the Coolidge administration. I looked up the roll of film, and there was a paper out in Arkansas or Oklahoma that asserted that much. That was all the proof he had. It's a piece of nonsense.
Let's go to New York City regarding Warren G. Harding. Hello.
Hello. Professor Farrell. On rankings of presidents, I agree with you more, simply because I teach in the College of Business, and we teach finance majors, management majors, marketing, management information systems students, and we approach history from an entirely different point of view, and as opposed to history teachers from our liberal arts schools. And I think we tend to be more middle-of-the-road teachers than teachers from liberal arts schools, and therefore Arthur Schlesinger and his rankings of presidents don't agree with, say, my colleagues, and therefore we have a much healthier or a much different view of rankings of presidents, specifically Harding and Coolidge, than liberal arts teachers.
Thank you. I'm delighted to hear that. What institution is that?
You still there? I think we lost that caller.
I think so.
Professor Trani, tell us just a little bit about Warren G. Harding's relationship with the Congress. How did they get along? What did they do together?
Harding worked real hard on that to make sure that he did much better than Wilson did. Obviously, Harding had come from the Congress himself, serving as a senator from 1915 until he became president as a senator from Ohio. And you just take one example of Harding and the appointment of the delegation for the Washington Naval Conference. Harding put two senators on it, Henry Cabot Lodge, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and one of the Democratic leaders, Oscar Underwood. So Harding again was working hard to make sure that the differences between the Congress and the White House were diminished, but quite clearly Congress chafed under Wilson. Clearly the League of Nations treaty defeat was a major setback, not just for Wilson, but for the presidency, a president trying to do something like that. And I think once the Congress got that taste of power, that clearly they were concerned about their rights, and while they appreciated Harding's efforts, Congress became a much larger force, particularly in foreign affairs, from the 1920s on.
More phone calls in a couple minutes, but again, we are live here in Marion, Ohio, in north central Ohio, at the home of Warren G. Harding and his wife Florence. They lived here for 30 years. The house sits on Mount Vernon Avenue in Marion, Ohio. You can see our set there, and the house is coming up right there on the left side of your screen. I'm going to go back to Melinda Gilpin, who runs the historic site here, to tell us a little bit more about the relationship between Warren and Florence Harding as played out in this house.
Well, I think the most appropriate place to start with that is here at the foot of their stairs, where they were married on July the 8th of 1891 after their home was completed. One of the things that we have here in the home is the clock that originally hung here while the Hardings married. I think an interesting aspect of their relationship was Mrs. Harding's superstitions. She did have quite a number of them, and one of them was that she had to be married on the upswing of the hour. She began her wedding at 8:30 in the evening. Many accounts say she had almost 300 guests here at the home for that. And she told her minister in no uncertain terms that if that clock struck 9 o'clock before he had pronounced them man and wife, he was to wait half an hour until 9:30 and pick up where he left off. That clock is the original that hung here in 1891. It was a wedding gift to them from a local jeweler. Also, that clock is considered to be the famous clock that stopped at the moment of Harding's death in San Francisco. Very famous story about that particular clock is that on the night that Harding died at 7:30 p.m., this clock stopped here in Marion for an inexplicable reason. The people who were living here in the home later learned that that was when Harding had died.
Melinda Gilpin, we're going to ask you to take a walk upstairs for us, because that's where the bedrooms are. And in case our viewers missed it earlier, give us some basic facts about the house again.
Well, the house does have, as I said, they lived here 30 years, from 1891 until 1920 when they left for the White House, 1921 actually. It does have a 10-room house, the first house in Marion built with a bathroom in it, and currently I'm walking into the master bedroom. This bedroom does contain the bedroom set that the Hardings purchased in 1910, completely made of solid bird's eye maple.
We are going to continue to take a look around that bedroom and talk more with Melinda Gilpin as time goes on from the upstairs of the house. Let's get a call from St. Louis. Hello.
Yes, great show. And I want to, well, I see Mr. Farrell. He's, of course, I'm from Missouri, and he did some wonderful work on Harry Truman. We make him a member of the state of Missouri, honorary member. Got some new books on Pendergast, I hear, and my kids are already in line for Christmas. Buy a bunch of books by Farrell. But to he and your other guests, very, very interesting. You know, President Truman got some very bad press. I thought was very unfavorable towards Truman. And I wonder, what about Harding? Was the press fair to him at all? Could you just give me some breakdown on that?
Professor Trani touched on that earlier, the relationship between the press and Harding. You said it was pretty good, right?
Yes, the daily press. Now, Professor Farrell has correctly pointed out there are 3 or 4 major writers, editors, who in the post-presidency period after Harding's death really went after his reputation. But Harding was very accessible to the press, met with them in some cases almost daily, and they felt pretty good about him.
Do you have a sense of how his paper, the Star, reported on his own political career?
I do not.
Melinda Gilpin, can you help us with that at all?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Well, the newspaper, that he ran the newspaper as Mr. Harding became a politician and ultimately president. How did the paper cover its own owner?
Well, very favorably, but Harding actually in his local town was fairly humble. Even his wedding announcement was just a small paragraph saying they were married here, what time, and where they went on their honeymoon and when they would be back. He was fairly humble, and although during his presidency and afterwards, of course, his friends were running the newspaper, people who had worked for him for a number of years, and they reported very favorably on him.
While we have you upstairs in that bedroom, why don't you take us around just a little bit more?
Sure, I'll be happy to. One of the things I think is most interesting in this room is the top hat here. It is a beaver top hat. It is original, and that is the one that President Harding wore during his presidential inauguration in 1921, March 4th of 1921. He wore it just that one time, custom made for him for that occasion. Another thing I would like to mention is about the twin beds here in this beautiful bird's eye set. One of the things I really do want to say, there's a lot of misconception that the Hardings kept separate beds their entire marriage, and that is incorrect. This bedroom set was purchased by them about 20 years after they married here in the house. We do have their original bed, which is in our guest room now. But we do believe that by this time Mrs. Harding was very sick with kidney disease. They were both insomniacs. They both suffered from a lot of stomach disorders, and we think that after 20 years of marriage, this became a pretty practical solution to trying to get some rest when they could and not be disturbed by one another up and down during the night. We do have original clothing on these beds, and one of the most interesting pieces of Mrs. Harding's is the one laying on her bed. That was made for her late 1921 or early 1922. The elaborate beadwork is representative of Egyptian hieroglyphs, and this dress was made in commemoration of the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in Cairo, Egypt, and would have been very fashionable as well as culturally reflective for the first lady to wear during the administration.
Let's get a call from Lebanon, Pennsylvania. Hello.
Hello. I really appreciate your series. I would like to make one suggestion that when you put the statistics up of during their administration, that you let it linger a little longer so we can digest it a little bit better. But I did read some things about Warren Harding yesterday in preparation for what you were going to be covering today, and I did read that Mrs. Harding had a daughter from a prior marriage, and I wondered if he ever adopted her. And it also mentioned that Nan Britton was seen with him in Washington and New York, where he was saying that she was his niece, and you have not mentioned anything. You said there was no proof of a relationship with them. I didn't know if this book maybe was inappropriate in that. And it also had mentioned that there were at least 2 suicides in his administration. His Veterans Bureau attorney, and then a friend named Jesse Smith, and I was hoping maybe you could address that as well.
Let's ask Robert Farrell to discuss first that last point about the suicides.
There were 2 suicides. One was the suicide of a man who was living in what had been Harding's house. This was when one of the scandals began to come close to him personally. He had taken money. This was involved with Colonel Forbes. He was a suicide, and there was a clipping on his desk that showed that he was concerned about what was about to happen, which was perhaps his indictment. This happened months after Harding's death. The other suicide was the friend of Attorney General Dougherty, who was a suicide, I think a plain garden variety of suicide. One of the new pieces of information is the detailed autobiography. It's 1,000 pages long, of the assistant White House physician Joel T. Boone, who was in the White House beginning in 1922. And there's a detailed comment about that suicide. Boone was one of the first people on the scene, and Boone was an honest man. He was a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and Boone said that it was a plain garden variety of suicide.
Now, the first part of that question dealt with the son of Florence Harding from her first marriage. Let's go back to Melinda Gilpin, because there's a room in the house associated with that, and tell us the story behind all that.
Of course, I'm going to walk from the master bedroom here to the adjacent room, which is what we call Marshall's room. Your caller was a bit misinformed about Mrs. Harding's first marriage. She did have a son named Marshall, not a daughter. And her first marriage was to a young man named Pete DeWolf. They were both 19. They eloped, or they said they eloped, although no marriage certificate has ever been found for them. It was fairly common at that time. And 6 months later, Marshall was born. I'm going to show you on the desk a picture of Marshall as a young child. Mrs. Harding was abandoned by her first husband when Marshall was about 1.5 years to 2 years old. He left her basically penniless and destitute, and her father refused to assist her, even though he was the wealthiest man in Marion, because she had disappointed him greatly by marrying Pete DeWolf. This room was included in the house for Marshall. He was about 11 years old when Mrs. Harding married Mr. Harding. Unfortunately, by that time, he was living with his grandfather, whose picture hangs over the bed, Amos Kling. And Amos was not approving of Mr. Harding any more than he'd approved of his first son-in-law, and he never permitted his daughter to regain full custody of her son Marshall. Therefore, Mr. Harding, of course, was not able to adopt him as a son. However, Mr. Harding was close with Marshall. He was considered to be very friendly, and children loved him quite a bit. I know in high school, Marshall apprenticed at the Marion Star and at one point fancied himself to become a newspaper reporter. The guitar that you see on the chair there was given to Marshall as a Christmas present from Mr. Harding one year. And one of Marshall's, they said one of the greatest gifts Marshall ever gave, and one of the things that he was most proud of, was he gave them a dog, a little bull terrier by the name of Hub, who became quite a favorite here in the household. Marshall never lived here full-time with the Hardings, but once he went to college in Michigan, he would return from his collegiate breaks and stay here at the home with his mother and his stepfather.
Let's get another call. San Francisco.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm calling from San Francisco, and when I was a little girl, about 10 years old, I was invited to this little girl's house, and her name was Anne, and we played, and it was on West End Avenue in New York City. And she said, I'm going to tell you a secret, but you must never tell anyone. So she took me in the living room, and she showed me a picture, and it was a picture of President Harding. I don't remember meeting her mom, but I might have. So that was my story. Whether it's true, my story is true, but whether the story about Nan Britton is true, I don't know.
So as the years went on, did you believe this?
Oh, yes, I did. I really did, because when I read the book, it seemed to make sense about where they lived, at the age of the girl, and the name of the girl. Everything seemed to dovetail, and I didn't realize until you mentioned that the girl was still alive and that she lives in Portland or someplace in Oregon.
Robert Farrell's done a lot of research on this. Want to respond to that?
Yes, this could have been Elizabeth Ann, who I understand is known as Anne. This could well have been her. But I don't think that proves anything beyond that point. Years later, in 1964, when the Phillips letters became public knowledge, she revealed herself as the daughter of the president. But I have to say that I have some information that later she broke with her mother. And it sounds to me from this information that there was a real estrangement there that lasted until her mother's death in 1991. I could go into that if we had time.
Professor Trani down in Richmond, we even pointed out that you are president of Virginia Commonwealth University, correct?
Yes, sir, I am. This is my 10th year as president.
Well, thank you for joining us via satellite from Richmond. We know you couldn't be here today. Tell us more. We touched on William Howard Taft earlier. Tell us more about President Harding and the Supreme Court. How many appointments did he make? Who were they, and what were their significance?
He made 4 appointments to the Supreme Court during his 2-year presidency. Obviously, he appointed Taft as was the major appointment to the Supreme Court, but he also appointed, I believe it was Justice Sutherland, Professor Help Me, there were 2 other names, 2 other people he appointed to the Supreme Court.
I think it says Pierce Butler
Sutherland, Butler, and Sanford you can see on your screen. These were all conservative people. Clearly Harding believed, had certain beliefs, and you can see the 4 people that he appointed, and they very much were in the mold that he was in terms of their beliefs.
And Taft was the only president to go on to the Supreme Court, correct?
I believe that is true.
Let's go on to Sunman, Indiana. Hello.
Good morning.
Morning.
We really appreciate your show. It has been a fantastic experience. The question I had was just answered recently about the son, Marshall, Mrs. Harding's son. So I was going to go on to perhaps your home director could make some comments about the construction of the front porch in 1903 and President Harding's unusual habit for breakfast, what he ate the most.
Melinda Gilpin.
I'd be more than happy to comment on that. Actually, the front porch story is a great one. In 1903, Mr. Harding was elected Ohio's lieutenant governor. On the evening of his election, so many of his friends came here to congratulate him that they overcrowded and collapsed the original wooden front porch that was on the house. In 1904, that porch was constructed, although the tile work that you may or may not have seen on the air was added specifically for the 1920 campaign. We have a house just down the street here in Marion that has a beautiful round front porch on it, very similar to that one. And Mrs. Harding told her husband that when he was getting ready to have that porch rebuilt, that she wanted a great big nice stone one like the one down the street. Was great with their entertaining plans. They often would drag that old Victrola we heard at the beginning of the program out and have all their friends over on summer evenings and have dances out there. Also, I can talk about his habit. His favorite food was waffles. Mrs. Harding had a very famous waffle recipe that he simply adored, and he liked to eat his waffles every morning smothered in chipped beef and gravy.
And maybe we can take a look at the kitchen a bit later if the camera can get back there. Knoxville, Tennessee. Hello.
Hello. My name is Miller. I used to live in Marion about 20 in the late 80s. I have a collection of autographs of all the presidents of the United States, and the one I have from Warren Harding, I used to go by his house every day. This is a White House letter dated September 23rd, 1921, to a James Knapp, and it concerns what we talked about earlier in the program on his masonry degree. This letter says, "My dear Knapp, please accept my cordial thanks for your generous telegram of today. I was delighted to learn of my election to receive the 33rd degree of Masonry, and I want you to know that I deeply appreciate the kindly feeling which prompted your message of congratulation. Very truly yours, Warren G. Harding." So I just thought that I would add that.
Thank you. Robert Farrell, was Warren Harding a religious man?
I think he was, yes. You see that in the speeches. And let me make a point about those speeches. The speech we heard this morning, I think there was a lot of content in that speech, and I think the audience's quiet was a sign of this. The usual point about Harding is that he didn't say anything. That was not true as we heard it this morning, but I back off from that one.
Let's go to Knoxville, Tennessee. Hello. Knoxville? One more time, Knoxville, Tennessee. Let's try Auburn, Alabama.
In a lengthy biography of Florence Harding that was published last year, it was stated that after the president's death, she moved out of the White House and spent several weeks at the Virginia estate of a friend reading, sorting, and burning the files and letters that were in the president's private safe in the Oval Office. I would like to know if this story is correct and ask Professor Trani what he thinks she burned and how complete the remaining Harding papers are that he's examined.
Eugene Trani?
The papers that I've examined are obviously the official papers of the president that became available in the mid-1960s. Mrs. Harding clearly is not the only member of a presidential family to review materials, to edit materials, and I do believe she did destroy some of the materials. Professor Farrell, I know you've studied Mrs. Harding at some length. Would you care to comment on that additionally?
There appear to have been some papers that were destroyed, but as I understand it, there were 4 bodies of material, and only one of them did she deal with, and just how much was burned and how careful that was, we really don't know.
Moore County, North Carolina.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. My question is regarding Manifest Destiny. This is one of the greatest tragedies of American history, and so far it's been ignored on your program. There's nothing done with our Native Americans. There are no great authors, no colleges. It's a big void, and I'm wondering why no president has ever been concerned to do something constructive about that. We are going in another century. There will not be another Native American left. Thank you. I'll hang up.
Thank you for sharing that. Any thoughts, Robert Farrell?
I thank our caller very much for this. I have to say that I have a text in American Diplomatic History. It's gone through 4 editions. 3 of them have a chapter on Manifest Destiny, and I think our American Indians are going to survive into the 21st century.
More on Warren G. Harding, the man, what he was like. We have some more audio so we can get a sense of what he sounded like.
It's a very alluring thing, Senators, to do what the world has never done before. No republic has ever permanently survived. They have flashed, illumined and advanced the world, and then faded or crumbled. I want to be a contributor to the abiding republic. None of us today can be sure that it shall abide for generations to come, but we may hold it unshaken for our day and pass it on to the next generation preserved in its integrity. This is the unending call of duty to men of every civilization.
Sir Farrell, tell us more. If you were sitting here with Warren G. Harding, what kind of sense would you get of the man?
I think I would have a very easy sense of the man. I have some reason for saying that this was a man without, shall we say, egotism. I think public office almost generates egotism. Wilson certainly had that. Taft had some of that. Theodore Roosevelt certainly knew that he was president of the United States. It's easy to say that someone is easy to talk with. Harding was, and Coolidge was, and Harry S. Truman was. I don't think perhaps Dwight Eisenhower was. This was a man with whom you could feel at home.
We have a caller from right here in Marion, Ohio. Hello.
Hi. I live in a house that Warren Harding visited. I don't know how many times or why, but my family were early settlers, and they were Republican, owned a lot of land at one time, and they all belonged to Masonic Lodge. And I wanted to tell you one thing about the Masonic Lodge. Since you're only about 3 blocks away from there, you might be able to get this information. My grandfather went to Lodge one night when Harding and General Pershing were there. And they have a list of the members that were there. I was the secretary at one time. And I don't know if General Pershing was in Marion to help him get elected or what. I don't know any of that. I don't know what date it was because I've never gone in to get the listing. But you might find out about that. And I do know that at one time they had sunrise service at the Masonic Temple in Marion, and there was a lodge where maybe they had the cornerstone that had his name on it or something. I heard an earlier caller talk about.
Thanks for calling from right here in Marion, Ohio. Let's go back inside the house because we do have a camera inside the library, one of the rooms we haven't seen completely just yet. Melinda Gilpin, tell us about the library and more about Warren Harding.
Well, the library of Mr. Harding's home contains his personal book collection. He was an avid reader, enjoyed reading quite a bit. I'm still upstairs in the home, so I'm going to tell you some of the other items that you'll be seeing down there. They do have a desk and chair that were used by Mr. Harding while he was an Ohio State Senator in the State House in Columbus. He used those during his Senate service. In addition to that, there's a wonderful golf club there that Mr. Harding received as a gift from a number of U.S. senators that he golfed with on a regular basis. It was a gag gift they gave him before he returned home to begin his campaign for the presidency in 1920. A number of items on that golf club are, I'm sure, easily recognizable to any golfer in the audience. And Mr. Harding loved that gift very much. It was said to be one of his favorite gifts that he received during his Senate service in Washington.
Professor Trani, down in Richmond, we saw the shot of the bookcase. Melinda Gilpin said he was an avid reader. Would you consider Warren Harding an intellectual?
No, I would not consider him an intellectual. And I think that is, again, part of the problem. I mean, he clearly read. There's no question about that, but Harding was sort of the person, the kind of person who gave others ideas than giving great new ideas himself. He synthesized what other people said, so I do not consider him to be an intellectual president, and perhaps that is yet another reason why his reputation has suffered.
15 minutes left in our program. Eugene, Oregon has been hanging on. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Doing fine.
Like the gentleman that called earlier, I have a small collection of presidential autographs and documents. And I have a letter from Warren Harding. I didn't have time to go dig it out, but I remember that the letter stated, "My dear Mr. So-and-so something. It gives me great pleasure to write this letter to you as a very private citizen." And I got the impression from the letter that he was glad to be out of the White House. Oh, he said, I wrote very few letters while in the White House, but it gives me great pleasure to write this letter to you as a very private citizen. Yours truly, Warren G. Harding.
Where'd you get the letter?
Oh, I bought it at an auction years ago, probably 30 years ago.
But clearly he died while president, so he must have written that letter during a vacation period of time while he was visiting Marin or some other place, because once he entered the White House, he served as President of the United States until his death. So
Robert Farrell.
He did not have a post-presidency period, as it were.
Thanks. Didn't mean to cut you off there, Professor. Robert Farrell, did Warren Harding enjoy being president?
I think he did. The presidency gave him a chance to go to the American people. He liked the American people, and that was one of his great qualities. I'm not sure that President Wilson liked the American people, but Harding did.
Let's go to Washington, D.C., our next call.
Hello?
Hello?
Hello, yes. My question is for Robert Farrell. I'd like to discuss the Harding genealogy, but from another point of view than the caller talked about earlier, regarding his, the possibility of mixed, racial ancestry. What documentation is there out there? Because, I've always grown up, being told by family members and family members who also knew many of the Harding family members that, there was definitely some mixed racial lines, on Warren G. Harding's father's side of the family. In fact, he had a sister, Warren G. Harding did, who, was a school teacher and actually taught in the black school system in Washington, D.C., I thought, at one time. It seemed this kind of just been brushed off earlier. I was just wondering, is there anything to this at all?
Thank you.
So far as I know, there is nothing to that. This was the invention, I would say, of W.G. Chancellor, who had had an appointment at Worcester College in Ohio, a man almost unbalanced, who lived many years thereafter. He published a biography of Harding in 1922, which is very difficult to find. I just saw a copy this morning. I've only heard of a half dozen copies out there. In both of those items, that is in 1920 and then again in 1922, he asserted this, but he had no proof so far as I can see.
A live computer chat room will follow this program at AmericanPresidents.org. You can take part in that chat room immediately following this program. And another reminder to our teachers out there, C-SPAN in the classroom. You can get some more information on our series, American Presidents Life Portraits. And 202-626-4850, 4858 rather, is the number, 202-628-4858. And you can reach us at cspan.org/classroom. New York City, what would you like to say?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Farrell. I'm Nan Britton's great-nephew. Her brother was my grandfather. And I've never been aware of any disagreement within the family as to who the father of her daughter was. And I'm disappointed to hear you say that you thought that there was some estrangement between my great-aunt Nan and her daughter over that subject. I'm not aware of any.
What I heard is that Nan's grandson had a story to the effect that after Nan died, the daughter, that is Anne, who was estranged, came to see the funeral director at a little town near where Anne lived. And the director, as a piece of perhaps courtesy, said, "And who was your mother?" And she answered, and then said, "And who was your father?" And she refused to answer. That's the story I heard.
Let's go back inside the house. Melinda Gilpin, who runs this historic site, is still upstairs, correct?
Still upstairs. That's
Where are
correct.
you?
I'm walking out of Marshall's room, which we most recently saw here in the house, and I'm going to enter the guest bedroom. We've just passed the master bedroom, and this is the guest bedroom. You had a caller earlier that mentioned the Native American correlation between many of the individuals that we've talked about on your series, and I'd like to start out by telling her a little bit about this particular piece. Warren Harding, during the Front Porch Campaign, in addition to inviting numerous people here during the campaign as celebrities, he also had delegations from a variety of voting interests. This little box, which unfortunately I'm not going to be able to open up for you today, is a box that was presented to him by a Native American delegation who came here in full tribal regalia during the campaign. You can see it's actually made of porcupine quills placed on bark. And it's just a little box that was presented to him during the campaign by the Native Americans that came here to support and endorse his candidacy during the 1920 campaign.
Let's get a call from Huntington Beach, California.
Yes, I'm calling to ask either of your historians, since you mentioned the membership of Warren Harding in the Masonic Lodge, if either of them know how many presidents of the United States were members of the Masonic Lodge while they were in office. I've often heard individuals like McKinley and others mentioned as being members of the lodge, but I've never heard a grand total. So I'd like to find out if either of them know. And I enjoy your series a lot.
Thank you.
It's very informative.
Thank you. Eugene Trani, can you help us with that?
No, I'm sorry, I do not know the answer. I know a number of them have been Masons, and it's been important for a number of presidents, but I don't have any idea of the number.
While we have you there, what was the most important or most difficult, most critical decision that Harding made in office?
How America, I believe, in terms of foreign relations related to the world without acceptance of the League of Nations. Clearly, the election was a referendum on the League, and clearly Harding did not support membership in the League in any way, shape, or form. What then does the United States do vis-a-vis the World Court? What does the United States do vis-a-vis Bolshevik Russia? What does the United States do vis-a-vis the countries of England, France, Italy, and in particular Japan, the Washington Naval Conference? So I think some of the most difficult decisions that he had to make, and clearly he had two good assistants, his Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, and his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, were what was the proper place for the United States in the world, and how could it relate to the countries, almost all of which had gone into to the League of Nations that the United States had refused to do. And I must say, in many ways, he did that very, very well. I think the Washington Naval Conference was clearly a major step to bring control over the issue of capital ships, battleships and cruisers, and to forge a relationship with the Japanese Empire, who clearly came out of the First World War feeling that they had been ignored and were wondering about their place in the Far East.
Let's go to Edmond, Oklahoma, regarding Warren G. Harding. Hello.
Thank you for taking my call. I'm a professor emeritus in English literature, and I have always enjoyed history. And I saw when I was a child, my parents showed, and I stood by the funeral train of Harding's when it went through Chicago, Illinois. But, and Mr. Farrell, I just appreciate so much your taking a positive attitude toward Harding and just, you know, explaining the falsity of so many rumors. I think, I've always thought he was a very fine man, but he was an honest man who didn't want to believe other people could be dishonest. And after hearing the program today, I feel that he must have he must have realized that the scandal was taking place, and that's what brought about his heart attack and his death. And I strongly feel that if he had lived, he would have been one of the first to have brought the scandal to light and would have, shown that he had nothing to do with it.
Thank you, caller. Robert Farrell, first question regarding that. Had Harding lived, would he have won a second term in office?
Oh, yes. Actually, Attorney General Doherty, rather to Harding's annoyance, announced that he was going to try for a second term. I think the trip out to Alaska was not to go to Alaska to get votes because those people couldn't vote, but it was to show himself, and Mrs. Harding herself said this, to the people of the West, some of whom, she said, did not know that they had a president. I think he would have run, certainly, but he couldn't have done it because his systolic blood pressure, when he came into office in 1921, was 180, which was almost a death sentence in those times when there were no medicines to bring down heart problems.
Melinda Gilpin, we've spoken several times about the death of Warren Harding. Not far from here is the burial site, correct?
That's correct.
Tell us about it.
Well, the monument is actually a quite beautiful one. It's on about 11 acres of property here in Marion. It is made of white marble, actually. Many of the statues throughout the house were made of white marble. The one interesting point about it in its design is that it does not have a top on it. Mr. Harding was emphatic that he wanted to be buried under the stars without a roof of any type over his tomb.
We have a call from, again, right here in Marion. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Melissa, did I understand her to say that Florence didn't have no sisters?
Melinda, did you address that?
No, actually I did not address that. My understanding was Florence had two younger brothers, but her father was disappointed that she was the oldest and a girl.
Any comment, caller?
Well, I knew she had two because I lived right next door to them on Fairground Street. And one of them was named Naomi, and every once in a while a niece would come and live with them, and I mowed her lawn 15 cents when I mowed it.
Thank you, caller. Melinda, what became of the house, the paper, the money that the Hardings had?
Well, Mr. Harding, the newspaper itself was quite an interesting story. Mr. Harding began to sell that, actually sold it off in June of 1923, a couple months before his death. I believe the sum was $550,000 of the sale, and about a down payment had been made by the new owners, but Mr. Harding died before the balance had been paid. And I believe the estate had to take the new owners to court to get the balance of that sum paid into Mr. Harding's estate. The home itself was taken over as a museum in 1927 by the Harding Memorial Association. Curators lived up here in the upstairs of the home while the downstairs was a museum for about 40 years. And in 1964 and 65, the entire house was renovated back into its original condition, and it was made into a full house museum. Taken over by the Ohio Historical Society at that time, and it's been an Ohio Historical Society site ever since.
Let's get one last call. Landisville, New Jersey. Thanks for hanging on.
Hi, this is Joe Sanagata from Landisville. My question has to do with U.S. Route 40, Highway 40, as it runs through New Jersey. It's called Harding Highway. We understand that Harding dedicated this highway here. I'd like to know what year that was and if they know exactly where it was done at.
Does anybody know that? Not hearing anything. Sorry we're not able to help you with that. Professor Eugene Trani, next week this segment will focus on Calvin Coolidge. What was the relationship between Warren G. Harding and his vice president?
Obviously Robert Farrell can answer this better than me, but I certainly think it was a cordial but not intimately friendly relationship, that Coolidge was a man to himself, and I think he recognized Harding's weaknesses, and he moved very quickly after Harding's death to separate himself from the scandals. I do believe that Coolidge's reputation which has gone through a fair amount of rehabilitation correctly, as far as I am concerned. And it'll be interesting to see in the years ahead what happens to Harding and the historians, whether Harding will ever go up in the minds of the historians. It certainly has not happened in the 70 years, 75 years since his death.
Last word from Robert Farrell.
I can only say that I wish it would go up because I think it should go up. And that's about all I can say at the moment. Thank you.
We want to thank our three guests joining us today. Professor Robert Farrell, who is a retired professor, author of a book titled The Strange Deaths of President Harding. From Richmond via satellite is Professor Eugene Trani, author of The Presidency of Warren G. Harding, also president of Virginia Commonwealth University, and Melinda Gilpin, who is Harding Home State Memorial, of the Harding Home State Memorial. She is Historic Site Manager here. Thank you very much for your help today.
Thank you.
Appreciate your questions and comments, and we'll see you next week with another edition of the series.